Could you, I hit the pause button just for a moment. Hey, folks, could you, sorry, it's a little hard to hear, John.
Okay.
Thank you. Please proceed.
All right. As of the end of September, solid waste disposal fund revenues were at 20.1%. Expenditures were at 17.9%. And again, that includes only the first 2 months of the year. September's cost won't be really recorded until October for bag revenue, curbside collection, and tipping fees. The loan report shows that we had $4,210,395 in outstanding loans issued through the town's various loan programs. There were no loans that were overdue. One loan was in default and fully reserved. And there was some court action regarding the outstanding loan from Cultural Intrigue, which we ended up writing off a balance of $67,837. So that loan balance was fully reserved to begin with, so it had no impact on our income statement. It was purely a write-off of both the loan and the reserve. Program income reflects that we had $475,715 in available funds for additional grants and loans as of the end of September. And then finally, the grant report gives you various information on the 35 active grants that we have out there and 4 grants that are currently in the application process. So again, another very active year in the grants area for the town. And that is the financial report for September. If you've got any specific questions, I will try to answer those for you. And if not, that concludes the report.
Thank you. I have 2 items. You must have.
No, I don't. I was reading it. I was like, oh, maybe I need to have a ton of questions for John because, like, it's his last or one of his.
Well, that was my second item. But, I just want to point out that the sales tax is frustratingly incomplete, probably at this time.
Very much incomplete
just because
at this time.
It's a trickle.
You'll see that number come up as the program gets fully implemented.
Right, right. But it is something there, so that's exciting to hint at the future. At least for me, I get excited about odd things, as we've already experienced tonight. I think my only other thing is just to celebrate and thank you so much for such wonderful years of service to the town. I'm sorry I didn't know I was going to be chair. I would have prepared something a little more flowery, but would you like to have the floor for anything? No.
I just want to thank you, Tim. I appreciate the recognition. It's been wonderful working for the town. I've really enjoyed it.
Of the finance department, we're proposing to have them added as people who can initiate wire transfers and to make our checks and balances in this area. Pretty cumbersome language here. That is the bank's language. That's the required resolutions for you to adopt. I'm not so sure that they have to be read into the record, although we can do that if you would like. But given the hour, you've had these. They've been published out on the internet. And if you approve the motion as it's proposed this evening, then you'll be approving the language that has been specified in John's memorandum dated September 30th.
Well, I'm fine with that. Given
Seems
the,
like a sensible thing to do.
yeah, it's rather long and flowery, so
Shall I move to approve?
I would, unless there's any other questions, I would take that motion.
Go for it.
Thank you. I move we approve resolution language provided by Community Bank National Association authorizing specific town employees to initiate and approve wire transfers as presented.
Okay. David has moved to approve the resolution language provided by Community Bank National Association as presented. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Aye. And that's 4-0.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. We didn't ask you what you're going to do with your retirement, but
You know, on the first and third Tuesday, you're going to come and watch the select board meeting.
Oh, yeah.
You can watch it from his hot tub or something. Unless he lives in West Brattleboro.
Then he has the leaves and the beauty of nature. We now move on to new business E, which is a discussion of our employee health insurance program. Peter?
Yes, so we're asking that the board approve the renewal this evening. There's a couple of points I'd like to make about it. We had several years of very affordable renewals, but you'll recall that they were achieved primarily, we had a couple of good years of health insurance experience as well, fewer claims and therefore smaller increases in the overall premium. But we also changed the structure of the plan, and so we achieved some pretty significant savings by taking on limited risk for the town with what they call an HRA layer, a health reimbursement arrangement. So the deductible went quite a lot higher. So we buy less insurance from Blue Cross Blue Shield, but the out-of-pocket cost for the employees remained the same. That layer in between, for the claims in between, is what the town insures for through our annual budget. And that has resulted in over $100,000 of annual savings compared to if we had just been staying with first dollar coverage from Blue Cross. But we've reached the maximum benefit that taking on that risk can provide. Basically, you get to a certain point where increasing the amount of HRA to become even more self-insured puts you at risk of catastrophic claims, running higher cost for the town, but where the insurance company for most of the participants in the program isn't going to save any money because most people aren't going to hit that level of claims in a year. And we've arrived at about that, and it's not a perfectly identifiable number. It's basically when you test the market each year and say, well, what if we took on a little more risk? What does that look like? When they tell you, yeah, but you wouldn't really save much more in premium, then that gives us our answer. So that's 2 years in a row now that we've seen that as the result of putting the toe into those waters. But what we did have this year, so last year we had a difficult renewal. We had some very significant claims and larger claims, total claims overall. And so we were looking at an increase well above 10%. We had increases the prior years, again, because of the restructuring. One year that was about level and other years that were well down in the single digits. Last year we started well above 10%. We ended up with an increase that was along the lines of 13% total impact to the plan. Concerns were raised at that time that we really couldn't do anything more about that. We needed to approve it and put the plan in place, but that we needed to address with the employees the matter of employee contributions to the plan and take a look at other ways in which we might save money without reducing the quality of the plan. We began a process of meeting with employees back in the winter around this issue. It is a normal part of a health insurance program for most employers that employees do contribute a portion of the premium. I will say the town employees recognize that, and we had really constructive meetings around how to introduce this concept back into the town's plan. It had been a cost sharing of premiums years ago, but when the town switched to a high deductible plan back in 2012 or 2013, we had switched over to the situation where the town was paying the full premium. Over the years, of course, when that stayed, the arrangement, and 100% of any annual increase was picked up by the taxpayers, that became a more difficult arrangement to defend. The employees completely understood that, and we had meetings where we talked about how to phase this in a way that it would be fair and affordable for households, but at the same time sort of bring back that element of the plan that is normal across other employers. It also gave us the opportunity to collaborate with the employees, with representatives of each of the 4 unions plus non-union employees, in a manner similar to when we had been looking at health insurance reform in general back about 4 years ago. And it was as a result of those earlier employee committee meetings that we actually came up with the HRA concept that has been such a created such a savings for the town. So we were pleased with the prior results. We were hopeful of incorporating that same kind of process and having some shared responsibility for how we would move forward with the plan. And arrived at the employees contributing 1% of the premium this year, 3% next year, and 5% the year after. And that's been memorialized, approved by the select board, and memorialized in the various collective bargaining agreements. So that is the arrangement we agreed upon. And at the same time, because the employees now will have a stake in the annual renewal, we thought we've had really good experience twice now in doing this work as a committee, bringing together the perspectives of employees from different parts of town government and the town administration and the expert advice that we get from the Richards Group. And we wanted to take advantage of that on an ongoing basis and look at the renewal each year as a team and see how we might, again, achieve better outcomes for the town's taxpayers and the employees. And in fact, in the work that we just did, the initial proposal from Blue Cross Blue Shield was a 14.7% increase in the premiums. We were able to work together through this process to arrive at a 12% increase, which is still substantial. It's still slightly above the market, which is running at about 10% or so. But it is also carrying the second half of that impact from the rough year we had with a lot of claims and a few very large claims. And so we think in looking to the future that we can expect and hope, depending on whether any significant claims arise unexpectedly here in the future. As of this year, the experience we've had so far in this calendar year has been below market and below our own history. So we're hopeful that the next year's renewal will be a more affordable renewal. But in the meantime, just by having the new arrangement, the overall increase in the cost of the program with the benefit, the mitigating impact of that HRA layer is 9.7%. And the town's increase for town taxpayers, because of the contributions now from the town employees, is at 8.7%. That is still a $200,000 increase, $202,000. So that's still about a penny and 3/4 on the tax rate. Not an insignificant expense at all. But given the broader context of the market and our own experience with high claims over the last year, we think that the process was successful and that we've arrived at the best outcome that we could. So with that as the background to how we've arrived at what's before you tonight, we do recommend that you approve the renewal.
Great.
Okay.
Anybody, I have my own frustrated comments, but anyone else want to make frustrated comments about?
Sure.
Oh, first let me just say that the frustration is not with staff's work on this.
No.
I think it's excellent work, and thank you to the Richards Group for being, sounds like a good partner in finding the best outcome.
They are, and good negotiators on our behalf with Blue Cross.
Actually, I had like a boring question before I launch into like a diatribe. On the plan renewal document with like the 2019, 2020 and the negotiated renewal.
Yes.
In the premium section,
Yes.
I'm presuming that S, D, and F are like single, double, family. I don't know what D would stand for. Like.
Yeah. So you've got it right. I'm trying to remember what the D actually speaks to too, but it's when there's a two people in the household.
Dual.
Yeah.
And then,
Probably dual coverage.
and then there's these numbers 41, 40, and 46. What's that about?
Those are the number of town employees who are enrolled in those portions of the program.
Great. Okay, that's really helpful. And so I was kind of like thinking about the cost for the town's health insurance within the context of the town's total budget. And it seems to me that it's about like 14% of our total town budget. I don't know if that is accurate.
Let me run that real fast.
It's high. I'm not
It's a lot, right? Yeah.
It is a significant expense.
It's a chunk.
As it was last year.
Yes, and
Yeah.
as it will be forevermore.
And
right?
you calculated it right.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, math win. And this isn't to say that I don't think that the town employees should have like really great healthcare. I think that everyone in the state of Vermont should have really great healthcare. And as somebody that has like been frustrated with how expensive it can be to try and get a health insurance plan that you can actually use. And it sort of goes back to what I was trying to say earlier about like how markets and like profit are not really helpful when we're talking about like equity and when we're talking about like health outcomes. And so I wondered, whether or not other municipalities who are all experiencing these similar hikes have talked together about whether there's lobbying to be done on the state level about moving towards a single payer model as opposed to this health insurance model. And I also kind of wondered whether or not you got feedback from town employees as to their experiences trying to use their healthcare, right? Because it's all well and good for everybody to have health insurance, but if the health insurance has, I know that the HRA helps with the high deductible,
Yes.
but even so, sometimes people feel like they don't want to use their insurance because they can't afford some initial outlay,
Right.
and they end up not actually having healthcare. They've just got a card in their wallet that,
Right.
in theory, means they could have access to something.
So the last observation that you made certainly is a real potential impact. It's not one that we hear complaints about.
Okay.
I think we would if it was affecting a significant number of employees, but I can't tell you that it's not affecting any households. What I would say about the overall value of the benefit and the importance of the benefit is the town employees appreciate the fact that the town has stuck with a platinum plan. And one of the things that came out clear in the discussions that we had in the committee work was reducing the breadth of coverage in order to reduce the premium is something the employees are not interested in. Even though that would now also save them money in addition to saving the taxpayers money. They would prefer that we do everything possible to maintain intact what is a very significant benefit. What provides flexibility in terms of providers and very good coverage for town employees and our families. So, so from that point of view, I believe, and that's reflected in the fact that through the collective bargaining process that we're nearly finished with for this 3-year cycle, the new arrangement where we've got some teamwork around this and some shared responsibility for it, but also with the provision that says that the town can't unilaterally change the program, that we only will change the program by working together, is an indication of the importance of the benefit, among the array of benefits for town employees. Having said all that, I think the point you make about lobbying is well taken. There's a lot of different ways in which, through the Vermont League of Cities and Towns and on our own behalf, municipalities lobby for things that are not just about municipal services and municipal government functioning, but are about issues of importance to our communities, beyond the reach of what we actually do every day. And I think this is an area that's ripe for that, and I'm happy to take that up with the league board. And it'll be, we've just completed a process where we've established the legislative priorities for next spring. But as we look ahead to the future and ways in which we might collaborate, among the municipalities of the state, I think that's a good idea, that we should look at how we might collectively bring more to bear around healthcare. So we should definitely do that. I will say that one thing the league used to do and doesn't anymore, because it became financially not viable in ways that I don't understand. I don't know the details of it, but the league used to actually offer a pool, a health trust pool for municipalities, in the same way that the passive trust operates for our property and casualty insurance. And instead, what the league has moved away to is being just a facilitator for some municipalities to the private provision rather than the operation of an actual health trust. Some years ago, before I arrived, so this goes back quite a ways, the town looked at that and said, you know, we don't want to be part of that. That sounds a lot like what Richard can do for us. So we've stayed with Richards. We've had good success with Richards, we believe, in addressing the challenges that they have come along.
Thanks.
Just a couple of comments. One thing about doing it statewide is that we lose that flexibility to work with our employees and with Richards. And that's exactly what the state is doing now in terms of the trying to create a uniform teacher's contract. But the negotiating position of the, well, it's the School Board Association and the superintendents and the special educators who are on one side, and then it's the teachers union on the other. And the effort is to shift the cost to employees. It's not to have any effect on the increasing cost of healthcare. And I'm sure you know that that's due to the incentives and the lack of incentives for actually reducing costs and providing more care.
May I just clarify one quick thing?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but I understood your point to be different than having the all the municipalities be in one plan. What I understood your point to be was for the municipalities to pool together to lobby for
Yes.
structural healthcare reform for all Vermonters.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that'd be great.
And, you know, because the $2.5 million that is collected to pay for our 140 town employees' health benefits comes from our larger community, right? It's
Sure.
We all have some skin in this game.
Exactly.
Right.
Well, it's been hard to get the people with good health care to lobby the state for that. And as you know, there was a pretty strong effort to
Yes.
create a single-payer system, and we'll go into that. The other thing is, I want to point out is that although it's a significant increase, we're at a lower starting point because of the changes that we made over the last few years. And just for context, the school districts formed an organization, the Vermont Educators Health Initiative, and the School Board Insurance Trust. And so they do combine, and they have over time been able to control the cost of, or have a lower increase than typical. Partly because it's a large population and it's generally pretty healthy. But that's no longer the case. And actually the increase for school districts, the Blue Cross Blue Shield this year is going to be 12.9%. So, you know, reform is obviously the way to go, but at the state level, it's, you know, there's no initiative for that to happen right now. I think much better focus would be on the national election. But anyway, it's not like these ideas haven't been around.
Well, thank you again for the efforts to make the best out of a difficult situation. I'm going to withhold my comments about the state of our national health care, just for today. Would anyone, let's get this approved.
I'll make a motion.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
I move to approve renewal of the town's employee health insurance program for calendar year 2020 as presented.
Thank you. Liz has made a motion to approve the renewal of the town's employee health insurance program for calendar year 2020 as presented. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? None, and that's 4-0. And next up, I've seen, oh,
I was just opposing.
oh, okay. Thank you. I've seen our friends waiting in the background. Steve Barrett is,
Ever so patient.
yes,
Thank you, Steve.
but I'm sure you've tuned
Couldn't
in
get Dan
from
to do
home,
it for you.
from the hot tub at home. Where did we start talking about hot?
It was me earlier. Oh, John.
John's retirement.
Good evening.
Good
Steve
evening.
Barrett, Director of Public Works. I'm here before you tonight to seek approval for sand bids for winter sand. We received two bids, one from Northeast Paving from Northfield, Mass., and one from Zaluzny Excavating. And what we did is we requested bids based on delivery of the product to our pit on Fairground Road, and also an option to go pick up the sand if we wanted to. Northeast delivered was $16.22 a yard. If we go to pick it up in Northfield, it's $9.91. Zaluzny is $10.40. to be delivered, and if we have to pick it up, it's $9 a yard. And what we're recommending is that we accept the low price proposal from Zaluzny for $10.40 per yard.
Pretty good idea.
Great. Thank you.
Anybody have any questions or comments?
No, I'm going to respect Steve's time.
No.
Move on to the salt mine.
Do we need to do separately or?
Motion.
We were going to do them
We
together.
styled the motion as
Perfect.
being both the salt and the sand. Can you
Excellent.
go
I can
ahead?
just proceed right to the salt.
Thank you, sir.
The salt is a little simplified because the State of Vermont Purchasing Contract Administration puts out bids for the different districts throughout the state, and we fall under District 2, which is Appalachia Salt of Rochester, New York, and for a low bid of $76 a ton. So we're recommending the state bid at $76 per ton.
How many tons of salt do we go through?
We go through about 1,500 tons
You're asking the right guy.
Yeah.
of salt. And we average probably, sometimes per storm it's 150 tons. And we store about 400 tons on site. So we, basically, there's a recommendation for how many pounds of salt you use per mile. We used about half of what the recommended rate is. And we also have calibrators in our truck to monitor the amount of salt that we use. We don't use any salt on the gravel roads, it's strictly on the paved roads. And we try not to use any sand on the paved roads because then we'll have to pick it up with a sweeper, and also it's a stormwater issue. So most of the sand goes into the country, the salt's used for the gravel roads.
Great.
Did you know Rochester was built around salt? That's basically why Rochester
Yeah,
exists.
the mines are indescribably huge and seemingly endless. There was an ocean when the glaciers receded, and that was the shore of the ocean, so it just
You
kept
also
expanding.
know that.
All right.
I grew up in that region, and one of the threats that you would hear from your mom is, "You screwing up in school, you're gonna have to walk in the salt mine." Yeah, thought they were in Russia, but they're not, they're in Rochester.
I've got a nice motion for you if you're interested.
Awesome.
I move that we award the bid for winter sand to Zaluzny Excavating of Vernon, Vermont in the amount of $10.40 per cubic yard delivered, and to award the bid for winter road salt to Appalachia Salt of Rochester, New York in the amount of $76 per ton per Appalachia's Salt's contract with the state of Vermont.
Thank you. Daniel has made a motion to award the bids for both winter sand and winter road salt to the aforementioned companies. Although, would you like to just make a quick comment before we vote?
Yeah, so has there been an environmental study on the quality of the salt that's being offered? Do the different salt providers, do they have different impacts on the environment? Do some add chemicals to their salt?
We do not add chemicals to our salt. This is just pure rock salt.
Of course, salt is a chemical.
Sodium chloride.
It is calcium.
Actually, it's a molecule.
Yeah.
Well, it is a chemical.
So there's been no studies on the difference of the environmental impacts based on the different providers?
I'm not aware of any.
Okay. That might be something to look into.
We'll take that into consideration. Thank you. So as I said, there's a motion on the floor for both winter sand and winter road salt awards. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
And that's 4-0.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Next, we have to speak on a Bulletproof Vest Partnership Grant. My words are not working
Two
anymore.
things about this. One is it's a simple little grant. It's an annual grant. It's one of those, most of the grants that we go for are competitive, but there are some that are just allocations where you have to file the paperwork and you get your allocation, and that's what the Bulletproof program is for each year. And our allocation for this year, that's why you get such a precise number out of this. So when they've divvied up the funds this year, our allocation for our police department is $2,517.16. So we're before you tonight to ask that you authorize us to accept and appropriate that amount of funding from the Bureau of Justice Assistance for the purchase of bulletproof vests by the Brattleboro Police Department. I've also been asked to just announce for the benefit of the public who may still be with us at 9:21 that apparently there's a lot of calls. I haven't personally experienced this, but I've heard that there's a lot of cold calling. You know, we all get a lot of solicitations, but apparently one type that people get is a call saying you need to write a check and donate to a fund because that's what's going to buy more bulletproof vests for your police department.
I've gotten that call.
That's not true. The bulletproof vest program is a federal program. There's a formula that drives it. It comes, you know, the money comes down from the federal government to the police departments. It is augmented with locally budgeted funds. It's certainly not, if there is any such charitable operation, it's not for the benefit of the Brattleboro Police Department. So we would urge that Brattleboro people receiving such calls devote their limited funds to better causes.
Thank you.
Skip. Definitely. Thank you for that PSA attached to that. I don't know about anybody else, but I feel good about helping to protect our town employees.
Absolutely.
Can it be very quick, Vicki? You certainly are able to.
You know, if you want to time me, you can.
Oh, no, not at all.
Okay, because I don't need any other pressure about to speak faster and to say my piece. Thank you.
Go right ahead.
So I remember that about $12,000 was approved for handguns for the police, and
That's not what we're speaking to.
but this is relative to what we are speaking to, and I would just wish that so much more. This is a motion to protect the police with defensive gear, and I just wish so much more would be invested into defending them rather than so much more was given to as an offense of giving them guns. Do you see the difference of like a fraction, like $2,000 to protect them with armor, and then $12,000 to give them the potential to kill?
This is an approval of a grant, so it's a little bit different.
And it's not anywhere near the total that gets spent on defensive equipment.
Correct.
Or protective equipment.
Right.
By protective, there's a difference between shields and guns, and I just wish that more was invested into shielding than guns. Thank you.
Okay. Who would like to, I wish John Allen was here because he would love the 16 cents. You missed his complaints.
Daniel, are you
Our
feeling
new members.
left out down there? You want to make a
Oh,
motion?
no, he did the last
Oh,
one.
you just
I'm
did?
good.
Okay. Then I'll move to accept and appropriate the Bulletproof Vest Partnership Grant from the Bureau of Justice Assistance in the amount of $2,517.16.
Thank you. David has made a motion to accept and appropriate the Bulletproof Vest Partnership Grant from the Bureau of Justice Assistance in the amount of $2,517.16. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
And that's 4-0 passing. The next item is Select Board Goals. How do people feel about this discussion?
I'd like to move.
I'd like a lengthy discussion.
I'd like to
Are we
move it.
feeling capable of having a long?
Yeah, I only have a...
I have a really
Comments.
quick request, if that's okay. I'm going to make it anyway, I guess. All right, fine. Under number 2 in governance, this is about Hub Coalition,
Yes.
and Peter facilitated a session at Town Fair just the other week, I guess.
Yes.
And maybe not right now, but like maybe you could write up a memo telling us about
Sure.
it. I'd love to hear about it.
Happy to do that.
And I just, in that same area, the 1 and 2 there, that people might want to consider beginning to develop some testimony that would like to deliver to the legislature when they start in January about why this is important to us, and try and keep that moving, and maybe contact people, select board members we know around the state to support that. And on the Charter Commission, I wonder if could ask staff to contact Spoon and tell him that we're still not going to appoint a commission. We're still.
He's aware, and I'm meeting with him on
Okay,
Friday.
great, because I just had an email about something else, and he said, oh, by the way. Okay, great.
Sure.
And then the other thing is, number 4, under diversity inclusion, the collaboration. I wonder if we could, for the next time, just keep a list of the organizations and projects so that we can be a little more documenting the progress here.
Yes.
Is that I know there's the diverse
It's-
workforce committee, but I don't know what else we do or
Right.
what other projects we're doing.
I'll try to be more complete in noting those as they come along.
That's what I mean,
The thing
yeah.
is, we've actually tried to make it such an ongoing part of the work that we're doing
You know,
that
you
it's,
notice
it's several times a month in different directions with different folks around town, sometimes for special events, sometimes for ongoing
Yeah.
meetings like the diverse
I think
workforce
if
group.
it's not just a real pain in the neck, just, jotting it down on a napkin
Sure.
and saving the napkins. It'd be fine, really.
Sure.
I know that there's a lot, and people ask and they criticize and they want to
Yeah.
know what we're doing. It would be great to see.
Yeah,
what
let me
we-
try to give you a more complete
Great. Thank
listing of that.
That's it for me.
I do.
You have something?
I have something to say, yeah.
Great.
First of all, I think I'm pleased with our progress since these June 4th goals, and there's a lot that has been done, and I commend the staff for, and ourselves for working on all of these initiatives. I think they're great. One of the things that I would like to add is that the staff, the planning department, prepared a very interesting downtown plan, charrette, and a series of events. And the town was encouraged, and there was a survey that was made, and I think there were some really constructive ideas that were brought forward in that process. It's a far-reaching plan, as I always think planning is, but we have the real potential to achieve the goals that the planning staff set, which was to take the disparate public open space that we have and create a coordinated plan, not only for the physical space, but also how the space is used and more equitably shared among our residents. So there were just some really good ideas that we should be noting, and we should keep on our list to track its progress. Maybe some of those initiatives can be brought to the select board sooner rather than later, because I think that they're just very timely and
Who
useful.
would, Sue would bring that?
Yes.
Yeah, great. That'd be great.
Yeah, I don't know if you got a chance to see any of
I
those.
saw the survey and I saw some of the initial results, but I haven't seen a report.
well,
I may have seen it, but
Yeah,
not.
it was very robust.
It's gonna be a few months.
Yeah, it's going to be a few months, but there were some, there were several architects on the team that Place Sense, our consultant, and they had some really good ideas for how to use our space and how to, just a fresh pair of eyes looking at the downtown and coming up with some really good ideas. And I want to commend them all for it, and ask that the select board really keep tabs on that as it goes forward and maybe enact some elements.
Yeah, I wasn't able to attend, but Daniel, did I see that you were?
I was all about it. I was.
Oh, yeah, we were all over it.
Oh, good.
It was
Good,
good.
because I was traveling for work, so. The only thing I was going to throw out is that I would like to highlight that we still want to talk a little bit about housing. And what I would like to do is, and I'll do my a little bit of research first, and I hope I'm not, stepping on any toes here, but I want to have a solid discussion about how we could consider changing our seasonal shelter into a year-round shelter, because I think this town desperately needs it.
Yes. I completely agree with you, Tim. I think that's a great idea, but one of the things is that the state only gives funds.
Correct. So those funds, those missing funds, which I believe are lower with a little discussion I had with Josh Davis recently. They're a little lower than I expected them to be. So I don't think it's outside the realm of consideration to be creative with funding sources, and try to have that vision for the town. But
We might,
You'll look into that and you'll let us know when you're ready for the board to talk about it.
I think so.
and would you talk to our local legislators, or shall I, about getting that warming, see what we can do about increasing the warming funds and having the state recognize that homelessness is a year-round problem?
Yeah, I think that's all. I think their funding is tied to federal, so it's complicated, obviously, but that's part of the puzzle that we have to work on with our
So I'll
legislators.
volunteer to do that.
Great. We can put our heads together and work
Yeah.
on our. We know where those people live.
Yes, we do.
Right. Can I ask one more little request, tiny little request? In the opioids crisis kind of data collection, so in the monthly reports at the back of this binder, the police department and the fire department always provide information on how many overdose calls they respond to, and the numbers are always different, and it's really hard to tease out whether there's like one of those is like them both responding.
Yes, it is hard to do
Yeah.
that.
And I wonder if there's a better way
And then
to
there's
communicate.
Rescue Inc. data, and
Right.
then there's Brattleboro Memorial Hospital
Sure.
data. It's a problem that people who are doing that work are working on and haven't yet solved, to try to make sure that overdoses, overdose fatalities, other data related to the public safety response to individuals who are being affected by the crisis can be tracked in a way that, instead of looking at it and saying, well, it's hard to tell what's overlapping and what's not, can instead be at a glance meaningful to us from month to month and year to
I
year.
remember, I forget which person it was, but they were talking about like a kind of a mapping
Yes.
software.
Yes, and I know that there's work underway around that.
Yeah.
I don't know the progress that's being made. That's another thing we could give you a memo on that would
Sure.
provide an update.
Yeah, that would be helpful.
Sure.
Yeah, I think we have some nonprofit partners that could help us with that task.
Yeah, there are others outside of town government who are on the point of the spear, so to speak, around that. We're working with others
Right.
to address it.
Yeah. Just like with housing, like all of these huge problems, it's not just
Right.
the people who are sitting in this room. There's like a lot of people in our community who are working on this stuff.
Indeed, and
Thank
we
you.
are lucky to have them.
Thank you.
Speaking of people in our community working on things,
Oh, yes, nice segue. Next on our agenda was, we have a potential nomination. How do we do this again?
But we only have one person, so
You
it's
only have
easy
one
to
team
say.
tonight.
You know, I have a shout out to Daniel Quip, who suggested at the town plan forum that people join the planning commission, and lo and behold, the woman sitting next to me
Was Prudence McKinney.
applied. So that's
And I
great.
have to take partial credit because I think I prodded her into doing something about 8 months ago. I'm just saying.
That's right. All these actions contribute.
and she served on the police fire community committee for the entire time of that project.
Wow, really?
I mean,
Yeah.
it's possible that we won't approve her nomination, I
No,
guess.
it's not.
No?
I think
I'll vote for it.
Prudence would be a good get for the town.
Good, very good. Thank you,
Um,
Prudence.
So, does someone want to officially nominate?
Oh yeah, I'd love to nominate Prudence McKinney to the Planning Commission.
Terrific. And all those in favor of that nomination?
Aye.
Aye.
And I believe there could be a last motion here for someone.
Move that we adjourn?
No second.
Yeah. All right. All those in favor of adjourning?
Aye.
Aye.
9:30.
Thank you for everyone watching in VCTV, etc. I need some catchphrase for the end.
Yeah.
That's all, folks.
That gets a lot.
Want to get started? We got
Good thing he's not coming to lunch. We wouldn't be able to eat.
fair amount of time. So we want to get started. We just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have enough. We do have a quorum. So first, we want to thank Mark Testian for having us here at Burton Academy, BBA. We're delighted to be here. We'll get to you in just a couple of minutes, Mark. Let's roll call, please. Give your name and identify where you're from. Start with you, John.
I'm John O'Keefe from right here in Manchester, Vermont.
Kyle Coutois from Georgia, Vermont.
Peter Peltz from Woodbury, Vermont.
Dan French, Secretary of Education from Manchester.
Jen O'Farrell, St. Johnsbury.
John Carroll from Norwich. Thank you all. Amendments to the agenda. There is one amendment. We have removed at the request of Vermont Higher Education Council. We've removed their presentation from today's agenda, and it's been being postponed. That's item J on your agenda. Higher Education Council wants to talk to us about some of our rules as they pertain to accreditation of post-secondary institutions, and we'll hear from them at the November meeting. And of course, you'll receive a first set of briefing documents with your packet for that meeting. That's the only amendment to the agenda that I'm aware of. Maureen, is there anything else that I should be thinking of? No? Okay. Let us then, we welcome Mark to speak to us, and and your target is about 10 off.
Good, I can do that.
Thank you.
So first of all, I do want to welcome everybody. Hi, how are you?
You can sit over here. Go ahead, Mark.
Sure. So, welcome everyone to Burn Burden. I will be done at 10 of. I thought what I would do is give you a brief overview, and then we have some more time later this morning, or actually I think early in the afternoon, to talk in more depth about how we're seeing the future of education. And it's titled The Future of Education at Burn Burton. We want you to see and understand and hopefully appreciate where we're trying to go with education, which I think will be in sync with a lot of your thinking, and is very much we think is very much in sync with current thinking on brain-based education and approaches. So we'll get to that, but I wanted to make sure we had a good understanding of Burn Burton. I have a little some slides to accompany this, so I'll turn this so you can see it. Burn Burton was founded in 1829, which makes us older than St. Johnsbury, not that we're competitive, but I just wanted to mention that, Jenna.
Thanks, Mark.
Sure. And this is a photo from the 1860s, and what I love about this photo is it shows the longevity and emphasizes the longevity of this school and its role in our community. You drove up today, presumably you drove up Seminary Avenue, and the only real difference between this view and today is, like, the trees have gotten a little bit taller over the course of that time. But we continue to play this role in our sending towns, and we are one of what they refer to as, what many people refer to as, the 4 historic town academies. We're absolutely and deeply committed to serving our communities and serving each and every student in our community. Are you wanting me to? Okay. And this is a listing of our sending towns right now: Manchester, Dorset, Londonderry, Peru, Windhall, Landgrove, Weston, Danby, Mount Tabor, Dover, Wardsboro, Sunderland, Stratton. For those of you who are not that familiar with this area, Wardsboro and Dover are close to an hour away. And Manchester, we're obviously sitting right in Manchester. Dorset is a contiguous town. Sunderland is a contiguous town. But we really cover a broad map of southern Vermont. If you live in a sending town, you do not have to send your kid to Burn Burton. But if you live in a sending town, we are deeply committed to the town in partnership, and we're deeply committed to the students in that town. So absent somebody who has a predilection for violent outbursts, you're going to be able to come to Burn Burton. We are covered, and I say that absent because we are, I haven't rejected a student. I think maybe over the course of my 12 years now, we've said to one, like, we really can't handle this student. There was a court order, there were sexual offenses involved, and we just felt like we're a very open and trusting community, and we're not set up to deal with kind of the certain extreme cases. We have full special ed. We're extremely proud of our special ed programming, and we're extremely proud of our commitment to our towns. We have a mission, and we embrace this mission very much. It's to educate students intellectually and morally for a life of responsibility, integrity, and service. Today is a day, you may have noticed that there are not a lot of students around. It's not that we don't have classes on Wednesdays. We have the 9th grade out in the field today. So the entire freshman class, 167 students, are out with their advisory groups on projects serving the community. So today is 9th grade service day. Today is 10th grade summit. So the 10th graders, we have a special program for each one of our grades. 10th graders they're engaged in a program called Speak Up, and they're going to engage in discussions around consent And the whole issue and the continuing issue, and we're hoping to address it early, but the continuing issue of sexual assault on college campuses and in our environment, including in high schools. So we're trying to educate kids and give them a vehicle for having discussions around what we consider to be a crucial issue in our society. Our juniors are taking PSATs today, and our seniors are working on college admissions and post-college planning. So we take this day as an opportunity to have a different kind of program. Dr. Mathis, how are you?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Sorry to
Go-
be late.
That's okay. I think your seat's over here. I just read the name tag. Just
Well, you're ahead of me.
how are you?
Okay, yourself?
Very nice to see you. I'm doing well. I want to zoom in on our core values because the first core value is going to be the focal point of this afternoon's talk. We developed these early in my tenure and came up with this term, engaging, vigorous educational experiences. And we came up with those words very intentionally with the notion that engaging makes a commitment that kids need to be, must be, should be a part of the educational process. So a teacher's job isn't just to teach. A teacher's job is to engage. And a student's responsibility is to be engaged in the process because that makes it better for everyone. So that engaging, that word means a lot to us. And then vigorous means a lot. We talked about all kinds of words, and you hear a lot about rigor. We need more rigor in this school. Nobody thinks of rigor and thinks it feels good, right? But the notion of vigor and a vigorous educational experience is one where you're deep into it and you're engaged, and at the end, and we've all been involved in activities where we worked really hard, we were deep into it, and at the end of it, we actually felt better than at the beginning, and we're surprised that the time was already up. It's a very high standard to have a vigorous educational experience, but that's what we're striving for, so that kids come out of their class more energized, not exhausted, like, wow, that was an exhausting and long class, but more like, I can't believe how fast that class went. We got so much done, can't wait for another one. That's the high standard. Some of the other core values I think are really important, especially for the kind of community we are, where we have, essentially open admissions. Respect for individual differences is essential to being a good community, and we use that and refer to that all the time. Whether we're combating racism or sexism, genderism, you pick your issue. If we can embrace diversity as a strength and teach kids to understand that diversity is an opportunity for learning, we're moving towards the kind of society that we'd like to be and probably aren't right now. The highest standards of performance and behavior, we're really just saying, we value achievement in all its forms. We value effort. And mindset of perseverance and reflection is getting to that notion that again and again you learn that talent is way overrated. It's perseverance and reflection and that cycle that leads you to growth. And then we strive to be a supportive and caring community, and you see that and can feel it every day as you walk around this school. I should point out that we have Dr. French, who is a now former parent. His daughter just graduated last year, and we have John O'Keefe here, who is a current parent of one student, and presumably your second daughter will be coming to Burr and Burton as well. He's wearing his Burr and Burton shirt, so that bodes well for us. A couple quick overview points with 2 minutes to go. One is we're growing, and we're growing in some significant ways. So in 2015, we were at 669. I want to say in 2013, we were at 630. But 669, 674, 688 in 2017, 710 in 2018. Last year, we ended the year at 767. We had a very large senior class. So this year, we've pulled back. We're a little bit shy of 750. But that obviously is an important growth trend. And I put here some sense of how many students are coming from sending schools, sending towns, choice towns. So somewhere between, really you could say 600 to 630 in any given year are coming from sending towns. We get another around 30 coming from choice towns. Those are towns who have not committed to pay our full tuition, but are choice towns, and they provide the statewide average, and then the families are responsible for making up the difference in that tuition. We have about 30 students who come from non-sending towns, and therefore they're termed private pay, meaning they don't get anything from their sending town. Bill?
Do you have a desired capacity or a limit?
And then we have about 60 international students. In terms of limit, and that'll get to this afternoon, what I say again and again and again, I say it to our board, and our board buys into it and supports it, is we need to be whatever size our communities want us to be. So if there are more people that want to come to Burn-Burton, I quite frankly never want to say no to a kid who wants to come to Burn-Burton. So if there were 900 kids that wanted to come, certainly my desire would be to say yes to all 900. Could they fit right now? No. Will they be able to fit in 2 years? We're in the midst of a construction cycle, so in less than 2 years, we'll have 25,000 square feet of new facility that is going to enhance our capability and our capacity if need be. If we don't grow, if we stay at this size, we'll take that new building, and I want to talk to you about it because it connects our educational goals with an architectural structure that supports a new kind of education for us. So I think you'll find that to be an interesting connection between education and architecture. We're not just building another classroom building with long hallway and a bunch of classrooms. But that will expand our capacity if our towns want us to expand.
Mark,
Yes, Peter. And you're
do you board the boarding students on campus?
about half of them, roughly half of them, are in houses on campus.
And adds additional cost to your buildings. I mean, to board students.
So we have buildings that are specifically for international student boarding. So about half, and then about half of them are in homestays. So in people's homes around the community, and that we found to be a very rich experience and cultural exchange. So we're diving, Sabina.
Yeah.
Hi.
So the international students, are they here for all 4 years? Is it a semester, or how does that work?
It depends. Some students come for a semester. Most come for at least a year. But I would say, the European students tend to come for a single year, kind of the junior year abroad concept. And the students from Asia tend to come for multiple years, graduate from Burn-Burton, and go on to college in the U.S. And so the game, and it's particularly China, but we get students from China, Japan, Korea, Indonesia, they tend to come with the game of getting really good at English, getting an American education, and then that has a tremendous value back in their home country. So, yes, Jenna.
Are all your boarding students international?
All our boarding students are international. Although if your big boy wants to come down and board here for the next game, we'd be welcome. He'd be welcome. I know that's not allowed. I'm not recruiting. I'm just saying the guy was unstoppable.
Mark, the growth of about 10% over 5 years, has it come from equally from all of those 4 sectors, or is it one place or another that the growth has happened?
So here's the dynamic, and that was a setup question.
Yeah.
I figured you'd ask. This was the size. This is our current 9th grade. Our current 9th grade, we have 167 students. If you count up the number of students who went to 8th grade in our sending schools and came to Burn-Burton, that number's 123. That gap, 44 students, came from outside of our traditional sending schools, 44. And if you look across the school, we had 110, including internationals, but 110 new students. There were probably 30-something international. So that says 44 transfer students into 9th grade, and then another 30-something into 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. What's going on again and again and again is families move into our sending areas. So it's not that the towns are growing through population, through what we might call natural population growth, reproduction. It's that our towns are growing because people with kids come here and discover that the educational, Dan coined this term, the educational ecosystem here. And it's a very strong ecosystem. And, you know, we're kind of at the center of it, but we're supported by very strong elementary schools. So people see the opportunity to come here. A lot of times jobs are much more portable now than they were, 10, 20 years ago. So oftentimes we have people who continue to work in New York City or elsewhere, but have a residence here, they live here, they buy their homes, their kids are growing up. Oftentimes they bring businesses here or locate their businesses here. And so this is part of the new economy that we're able to capitalize on.
I think people move to town, obviously they come to town hall and they'll want to change their water bill or something like that. And we always say, especially somebody about my age, we say, well, what brought you to Manchester? And the answer 9 times out of 10 is the educational system.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We need to stop here. We're going to be, I think you're joining us for lunch, are you?
I'll join you for lunch
And we'll also have time to carry on this discussion.
Good. I'm going to give you a closing slide just to give you a hint of what's ahead. Mr. Rogers. We'll leave it at that. I'll explain it when we sit down.
Thank you very much.
Okay? Thank you,
Mark,
folks,
and
you
thank you
guys
for
have a
having
good
us.
meeting.
Thank you very much.
Mark, where is lunch?
Lunch is going to be right over there. We thought we'd set you up here, and then lunch you'll have the nice view of the
My daughter might stop in.
Okay, great, good.
She's
All right? Thank you.
All right. Board, we're now at item C in the agenda, and the question is to take action on the consent agenda. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda, which it's been moved? Let's just be clear that the consent agenda consists of, pardon me, 3 sets of minutes. That is the minutes for September 18th, the meeting in the morning, September 18th, the retreat in the afternoon, and September 19th, the retreat all day. It's been moved. Is there a second?
Sure.
It's been moved and seconded. So we're taking action in approving the consent agenda, in approving all of these minutes. Bill?
Perhaps at some point in the meeting, I'd like to discuss the layout of the agenda in terms of using our time more efficiently. And we could either do that down below, or we could do so now.
If you're comfortable with it, I'd suggest that we include it on schedule item L, which is where we're talking about future meetings.
Perfectly
Is
fine.
that okay? Thank you. So I take it then that there are no proposed corrections to the minutes of these 3 sessions. Is that correct? Are you ready for the vote? Those in favor of the approval of the 3 sets of minutes, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Nay? None. It's unanimously approved. Thank you for that. Board announcements. Are there any members who would like to announce something that they think is important and pertinent to the board's work?
One little thing. Last month, we were talking about the report card. And there's a new Gallup poll that came out in the fall, as it always does, and said that only 23% of the people mostly parents, looked at the report card, and something like 50% of the population didn't even know that they had one in the states where they had them. So, just FYI.
Yep. Any other members, voting members, comments? Student members, do you have any reports or any comments you want to share with us from your world?
At BFA, at the moment, we're having some issues when it comes to transcripts. Looking at that, there's been a lot of staff changes when it comes to administration at our school, so there's been a lot of issues with looking at proficiencies and putting them onto the transcripts, because it's just been hard for them to make some of the transitions into doing proficiency grading on like a transcript scale. So there's been a lot of meetings with administration talking. They've owned up to it, but they've said that in the past that they were unsupported by the board and like the local board, state board, and the agency. But it was at the meeting last night, Senator Parent, he's part of the education committee, stood up and said, you could have talked to us at any point. There's open communications on both sides, so you just chose, like, we have all the resources to help you. We could have sent someone to help you, and you just haven't said anything to us yet. So after that, they took ownership, and they basically, to summarize, they basically said, yeah, we messed up, and there's more work to be done. So hopefully, they gave us our updated transcript Tuesday, but there's still just some issues with it, with how it's balanced. But at the moment, I think things should settle out pretty soon. But that's what's been happening at BFA.
Oh, interesting.
Can I comment on that?
Yes.
After 77 was passed, I spent, shortly after that, I was up in St. Albans and talking about, and there was a huge divide between the college-bound kids and those that were taking kind of alternative courses which were being offered.
Yeah.
And it was a dramatic divide, and it sounds like that really hasn't been attended to or resolved, but it was pretty dramatic. I mean, it was almost like those kids, they get a good break because they can do these things and they're not college tracked or whatever. It was dramatic.
Yeah, like there's been some, like how they've done things is they've kind of messed up the scaling a little bit, where normally students who wouldn't pass, they've just kind of bumped them up so they will pass, but they've given no equal bump up to students that are in whether they're in like the middle, like a B area or higher.
Yeah.
So it's this strange divide of students who normally would be C, D students are now B students, and students who have worked hard to get that B are now lumped in the same area, and then the students who want to stand out have to work just that much harder to be in that top rank. Like I know a student who's trying to get into Stanford, and he's been having trouble because there's no real class ranked with proficiencies, and he needs one. So he was like, can I get a class rank? I need my like GPA to be like accurate to my grades, because he's like, I know I have the grades to get in, it's just not displaying it. So there's been issues like that.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Sabina.
Pick a harder school to get into.
I mean, this is kind of going off the report card thing. Our school uses Jump Rope, which is an online platform for showing grades. And a lot of it is they just send out an email to the students and parents, one email that has the login information. And so a lot of it is like, my parents, I think it took them 2 weeks before they realized that that email was in their inbox and they were able to get into my grades and to view them. And the other thing to address that proficiency-based thing is we do have professional development on Mondays. And so the teachers meet with other teachers in their department on Monday mornings for an hour instead of teaching, and students come in an hour later. And a lot of that is to try and develop that coherency amongst teachers. So like all of the chem teachers have a very similar layout of what they teach, and so like if you miss one of the chem labs, because the teachers have been talking, you can go join another chem class and do that lab so you don't miss that work. And so that kind of helps to address the individual student issues and the grading, and so there is more of a equal sort of grading amongst students. But I think the report card thing is kind of interesting that, a lot of it has transitioned to online stuff, and what happens to those families that don't have access or don't understand how to access that.
Very good. Thank you both. I want to just update you, as you're still wet behind the ears chair, on some things that are going on sort of in the background. One of them is that you may recall that this board is the hearing panel for an appeal by an educator. I believe his name is Mr. Macias. Is that how? Macias. And our colleague John is chair of a two-person hearing panel, and we've been notified that we'll be receiving pre-hearing documents soon, perhaps by the 18th, and that the hearing will be scheduled for sometime in December or January. So it's still happening. Second, I wanted to just update you on my efforts to make sure that folks who have a particular interest in special education and the new rules under 173 have some grasp of how they can be heard in this process. And of course, we're hearing today from the Special Education, or the Census-Based Funding Advisory Group, which was created by the legislature in Act 173 to comment and advise about the rulemaking. But there's another group called the Special Education Advisory Council, which has existed for, I think, many years as sort of an adjunct of the agency.
It's a requirement of federal law.
Yeah,
that
thank
every
you.
state have one.
Thank you. And I was intrigued at the August meeting. A member of the audience stood up and spoke about that advisory council and referred to it as dysfunctional. So I immediately contacted the contact person and got no answer. So I pressed again and eventually was put in touch with the new agency employee who is the new director of special ed. And spent some time on the telephone with this person, Jackie Kelleher, because she apparently is the agency's liaison with this entity. And I simply outlined to them the process for rulemaking and the windows of time that people will have to comment, and encourage them to, if they wish to comment on the special education rules, they better speak soon because the train is leaving the station before long. This is sort of old news, but we're no longer members of NASB, or at least as of the beginning of the year, we no longer be members. We withdrew our 2020 membership in NASB. That was accepted with regret by the executive director of NASB. That leaves $25,000 in our less than $100,000 budget. In other words, more than 25% of our budget remains now intact and uncommitted. And there may become circumstances where the board will decide it wishes to spend those funds, and possibly in connection with Act 173, but that's yet to be determined. So we'll just know that there's that $25K there, and it may be available to us in the event that we feel we need outside counsel or expertise in connection with our work on any topic. Yes, Peter?
So this may be more directed to Dan. In so much as that is our budget. It's our but we don't have direct access to it as such. You control the disbursements of those funds. Is that correct?
Only the mechanical aspects of it. I mean, you direct that to a certain extent. And John had reached out on some of the mechanics, so we have a process available to you, but we don't say yes or no per se, other than to make sure it conforms with your budget.
Okay, so that's up to our discretion.
Yep.
Some of you have expressed interest in the integrated field reviews. Both Jenna and Bill have expressed some interest in that, and you've seen Maureen's, or I think it was Suzanne's email about that. And to all of you, if you want to know more about integrated field reviews, the AOE website has a a very good section devoted to them, including some actual integrated field reviews that you can click on and study. And they make for interesting reading. The Sunset Advisory Council, I want to thank you for your input. The agency staff was kind enough to furnish me with the audio tape of the 19 September discussion that I was not able to be present at. And so I listened to your comments on this topic of the Sunset Advisory Commission, and then I composed probably an overly long response to the Advisory Commission's questions. I was, as those of you who know me know, that I was sort of running up some flags to see what response we might get on some of the other issues that we're talking about, our future and where we're headed. So I hope you've had a chance to see my overly long response to the Advisory Commission.
Might I say thank you, because that was a strong affirmation of the need for this board.
Thank you. Bill, you had a comment?
Yes, same thing as Peter is saying. I really appreciated your doing that. It was thorough and complete. The IFR thing, I'd like to go back to that and ask a question if I could.
Yes.
There was only 1/3 approximately of the districts in there. And this has been in place for many long years, at least on the law, but we're just now getting to the implementation. I was just wondering why the other 2/3 weren't in there.
Commissioners, Madam, Mr. Secretary.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I did put your question back to our web team. You know, we've gone through a couple iterations of web platforms since the IFR process was erected. But to your point, the chair, if you're interested in learning more about the IFR, we should schedule it perhaps as an agenda item, and we can do a formal presentation and answer those questions. I mean, it's part of, as you know, we struggle with coherence inside the agency because we get so many demands, and we're perfectly fine to respond to individual board members' question. But if this is of interest to the larger board, and it's emerging now as a conversation on an agenda that the topic was not warned,
of course,
I would say the public would have an interest in this, so we should put it on the agenda and we could present, you know, or get organized and do a presentation for you on it.
Yeah. And as I recall, first of all, it only really got off the ground about 2 years ago.
Yeah, when I was leaving superintendency in 2016, they were starting the articulation of designing the process, so I think it was piloted around then and the following year.
And, and it was intended that it would be a 3 to 4 year cycle before they got to every school.
Yep.
So that's partly why you're seeing maybe only 20% of the schools have.
Yeah, I'm not sure we have that answer yet, though, but I think it's partially due to we probably have others that could be on the web that aren't, and it's probably more a function of our website, I'm guessing, but we can dig into that.
Since this evaluation is one of the most important things that we should be doing, I think an update would be useful.
Sure. Yeah, it would almost be like an annual, part of an annual sort of check-in on the quality oversight function.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And the last thing I wanted to just mention is, as you know, we have a board vacancy, the unexpired term of the former chair. I've been in touch with the governor's office to say, so what is happening? It's over 2 months now since the chair submitted her resignation on the 8th of August. And I am assured that the governor has reviewed candidates and that a decision will be made and announced in time for the November meeting. So that's about a 3-month cycle time. I had thought by now things might go a little faster than that, but that's I guess we should be glad to know that we'll be back to full strength at the November meeting, which is a good thing for lots of reasons. I think we value the diversity of points of view. Every member here brings something truly valuable to the discussion. And moreover, sometimes we've been pretty tight on having a quorum, and that really impedes our work. So I'm really pleased to know that the governor's office will have this for us soon. I guess in a less formal thing, I want to say that I've listened to the tape of the 19 September retreat, I think almost all of it. And I must say, you seem to be a very learned and considerate body. As I listen, of course, I know that not to be true, but it's a very impressive discussion that I heard. Pardon?
Did we leave early?
Yeah. And it was there's a term I love, excurd, which is to go on excursions, and you did do some excurding. And so therefore, perhaps there wasn't the exactly on-point conclusion that we might have hoped for. But frankly, you did very hard and important work, and I've taken note of where there seems to be consensus. I've taken note of where there are particular concerns, and I hope we can build on the work you did. And some of that building, I believe, will happen this afternoon. At least 3 of the topics that you had on your agenda are back up to sort of see if we're at a conclusion, or if not, what further work we need to do. So I really thank you for that, and I thank Jenna particularly for holding it together and keeping it on track, and Dan, you too helped a lot with that. But each of you contributed. I had to strain to hear some of your voices, but it was worth it. Each of you had some very useful things to say. I also thank you for these evaluation forms. Maureen put this together, and your comments were encouraging and helpful. So thank you for that. It's now 9:15, which means it's time for the Secretary's report. Right. I'm a little late. Well, I think the Secretary's at 9:10, so I'm a little late, Dan. I apologize, but I know you can do it.
I can compact my comments. Good morning. Basically 3 things I was going to mention. One, I think you're aware the agency has moved, or at least 2/3 of the agency has moved. So we moved 2/3 of the agency on the weekend of October 4th. That went well. The remaining third of the agency still is at Berry City Place, our prior location, and they'll move on the weekend of November 8th, and then we'll be complete. So at some point, perhaps we can give you a tour of our new space, but that's going well.
Mr. Secretary, just a real quick question, your doctor's secretary, I'm sorry.
Just Dan or secretary would be fine.
Is somebody else moving into that space? For
Berry
the
City
agency?
Place?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the whole move process, I mean, it's been a year of planning, involves 4 agencies, possibly 5. But it was really a consideration of a number of variables. One was how to make better use of Berry City Place, and the Agency of Transportation will fully occupy that building.
I was just curious because it
You might remember there was Positive Pie downstairs, the
Yes.
pizza place.
Yeah.
That was totally turned back over to state. The state's leasing that, so AOT occupies that space. That space was reconditioned for
Oh, that's too
AOT's
bad. It was
usage.
good pizza.
Yep. They have other
Berry's
establishments.
lost.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
But it's nice for Barry that there's still actually a larger state office presence in the downtown.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah.
Because it clearly
Yep.
is a downtown economic development.
Yeah, so they, as an
strategy.
agency, more or less fit inside that building, where we only occupied 2 floors. And then, there was the fire at National Life was one of the variables. National Life, as a company, wanted more space on their campus, so there was a number of things going on. But the current 2/3 of the agency that moved, including my office, we moved onto the 5th floor of National Life State Office Building, and then the remaining third will occupy about half of the 4th floor. So we won't be on 1 floor, but pretty close. But we'd love to have you come over sometime and take you on a tour. Second item I'd mention, yesterday we did the public announcement of the 2020 Vermont Teacher of the Year. It's Elizabeth Kahn, who's a foreign language teacher, a French and Spanish teacher at the Main Street Middle School in Montpelier.
Which one was she of the 3? Do you remember?
I think the first one who spoke.
She was the first speaker.
one.
Okay.
The one who'd done a lot of international.
Yes, she had done some work in Africa, I believe, and Middlebury graduate. Very articulate teacher, and we had, we're still working. We kind of did it a little differently. This program of Vermont Teacher Year has changed several times in my career. We have a partnership with UVM on it now. We're still going to do that, but this year we decided to do the sort of the public unveiling, if you will, at the teacher's school. So we had a wonderful experience yesterday. All the students were there. The students did not know the purpose of the assembly. So it was a surprise announcement, and they really enjoyed seeing their teacher acknowledged in that manner. We also had nice participation for former Vermont Teachers of the Year. So we had about 5 of them there, and they came, which we've tried to
that's
involve them more in the process. So I think, well, we're going to debrief on how it went. It went fine. It went very well, actually. But I think there's more work we can do with that award to elevate the teaching profession in the state. But I think it went well. And just the third thing, I'm just going to comment on the proficiency conversation. To Kyle's observation, proficiency grading is different than proficiency-based learning, but a lot of schools have gotten tangled up on the grading piece, particularly around the transcripts. And there hasn't been, it was very uneven deployment of the initiative when it was passed back when Peter was saying Act 77. So to me, it's not surprising to find places that, have transcripts still with traditional grades and GPAs and proficiencies, and schools are doing all kinds of things in that regard. But there's a key component, as much as the state senator was very accurate in saying, we could help you, but you also, the state board owns a part of this because your regulations are where some of the devil in the details are. So we've had a series of presentations starting in the spring around this issue. If you might remember, we had some agency staff briefing you on the quality standards where this issue resides. And there is a requirement that schools implement proficiency-based learning by 2020. Then we gave you some briefing on the report card with the idea of understanding, how we might measure quality. And then last month, we brought in sort of the data team to give you sort of an understanding of the back office, if you will, operations of how we put that together. I would just say that one of the things when I travel around as secretary, which is a privilege of the position, this is one of the issues I listen to, and to hear how people are doing with it. And so I've encountered 2 presentations or 2 voices you might want to entertain at some point in a future meeting. One is the Tarrant Foundation. I was thinking of them largely, if you remember in August, you had the Vermont NEA publish their survey results, which was very interesting and useful to you. And they did a presentation, I think, at your August meeting. Likewise, I've heard from the Tarrant Foundation, which does statewide work on innovation and technology and has been attentive to this issue. And they've pretty much scaled up to the point statewide where they have a good perspective on what's going on. And they've recently published a book under the Harvard University Press. But they would be a good voice to hear, and I know they'd be interested in presenting to you on what they've seen statewide if you're interested in continuing that. The other one is I met with the guidance counselor statewide on the issue of the transcript. And it was interesting talking with them that one of the things they surfaced, which is not a perspective I've heard as much of, and it reminded me of my time as principal, a lot of where the transcript work happens more frequently is on the sort of the day-to-day as students move in and among our schools. And then one of the problems they find very challenging, probably more so than the college end of it, is how to do that translation as students move from high school to high school, since the proficiencies do not align. It's one thing to send it on to a higher ed institution, which also has the school's profile, the students' SATs, and so forth. But it's another thing altogether to try to do that alignment from school to school when the alignment doesn't happen. So they'd be very interested in speaking to you on that topic and sharing their experience. So at any rate, I will keep track of those conversations as I encounter them, and I'll work with the chair to surface them, possible agenda items. But I think it's something at some point the state board is probably going to have to visit because you own part of that conversation. And the agency certainly has a perspective on it too. We have a lot of expertise and resources.
Peter?
Are you heading towards a statewide assessment system in regards to this? That was a flaw of 77. It was really up to the districts to implement this. There wasn't a statewide to be.
We have a component inside the report card to measure personalization, and this would certainly be a piece of it, if that's what you mean.
That's what I mean.
Yeah, some sort of how are we going to know your regulations?
It sounds like uniformity is an issue.
Yeah, it is. But yeah, we certainly, we're planning, we have a component in the state report card on personalization and anticipate PLPs anyway being a component of that. But we certainly could talk about doing more in that regard. But it's something we have a good finger on as well. But I think it's something, I just keep elevating it to your interest because I think you own part of that conversation because your regulations sort of describe the work or the context of the work that's going on.
Kim?
NEA's report on it or the breadth of work that the Tarrant Foundation did with it, but I'm just wondering the context in which we would bring more information to that, I think, is helpful to understand too. Would it be for the purposes of saying we shouldn't do this, or there's best practice that exists and we want to scale that? Where in the regulations is our role in that, just so that I can understand that better? And I know that there's wide variation in how these are being implemented and exercised, and that doesn't help when some schools are taking 1 or 2 kids from the state of Vermont and they're really not able to even understand among those applying how they're presenting. So I just would appreciate a little more context on what our purpose in hearing from these folks would be and what piece is our role specifically, so that we would know what to do from there. I do see that there's a transferable skills sample graduation proficiencies and performance indicators that the agency has out there somewhere. So is that guiding the work? Is there a way for that to be what you're looking for at the state level, so that that back ends the way it's being implemented? 1,000 questions, I apologize.
Yeah, no, it's good. I'm gonna write those down right now.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Well, we are the owners of the rules. And so this gets to, ties back to our much larger scale discussions about sort of how we want to be spending our time and whether we're really good at that or not. I think it's probably fair to say that if the rules need to be changed or sharpened up or made more precise or less, the actual work in doing that will come from the agency. I mean, I don't think this board is ever going to get so deeply into this topic that we actually know how the rules need to be changed. And so that gets into the question of, well, if the agency's doing all that, what's the role of the board then, other than to say, that makes sense, okay. You know, I don't know what expertise we bring to that conversation. So I think it's obviously a topic we want to understand better. I think probably many of us hear from constituents who have concerns about proficiency-based learning and grading. But quite beyond that, whether or not we as a meet once a month group of lay people bring very much expertise to actually reshaping rules or anything else about the way the program is designed. I could imagine, for example, that the board might compile a profile of what the concerns and issues are at a sort of high level, and that possibly the board could serve a useful purpose in conveying those concerns to the General Assembly or sharing them with the agency, although the agency knows better than we what these issues are. I think this is a classic case of we own the rules, but we don't have a lot of expertise, and it's the agency who does all the work. No.
Peter triggered something there in terms of having uniformity while personalizing things. Well, that's a bit of a contradiction. But it does remind us that this is a squishy kind of business, and there is a lot of debate across the nation in terms of how to implement proficiencies. And so I think at some level, since we are charged with the evaluation component, I think you're right, Mr. Chairman, in terms of our review has to be at a high level. We can't go down here in the weeds, but there are certain things and concepts that we'd have to look at.
Yeah. A squishy kind of business. I think that's a very valuable term. And but that's not to say, though, that or to diminish the importance of the rules. I wouldn't want to think of them as weeds. They are vital, but they require a level of understanding that we're not likely to achieve, it seems. But that's for another day. Yeah. Kim?
I just wanted to follow up and just listen for my putting myself in the right place when I'm sort of studying the issue. Which set of rules did we approve that govern Act 77?
ask others.
Yeah, they're in the education quality standards.
EQS
Yeah.
is the
Yeah.
2000.
Yeah.
So, and it speaks specifically to Act 77.
Yes, and specifically the galvanizing point of a lot of the conversation is a requirement in your rules that requires the implementation of proficiency-based learning by 2020.
Right.
Right.
And graduation.
It has a specific date, which is unusual, I would argue, for
Proficiency.
rules.
And by the way, was that specificity included in the law?
No, I don't believe 2020 is in the law. I think
No?
it's something, it was translated the rules. I think so.
That's the story on the
Yeah,
street, is
yeah.
that it was the state board that
I'll
kind of,
verify that. But
forced
that was,
this.
when I was working with districts
not the
on this, I think that's what we
I
found.
got a green book.
I don't have it with me, but I'm looking at the law bill.
Bless your heart.
It's online. Oh, yeah.
Section 165.
Can I pass it?
We'll give this another couple minutes and then we'll
Yeah.
move on to the public to be heard.
I guess I just would love for us to, if the intent was such that it was important to make relevant education, that it be personalized, and that demonstrating proficiencies are not just checking boxes or having random grades that mean nothing, then that's, if that intent is still valid and seems like a good idea in general, then what is the responsibility of us sort of evaluating where we are, and what is the responsibility of the agency in providing field support to be scaling best practice or providing guidance on best practice or professional development? And I don't know where we sit in that. So again, sort of to context, if we were to be exploring this further versus either reversing or reacting to people not being able to get it right. If we're getting it right, is it still as confusing when teachers are commonly grading because they have a common set of standards, and you can go to a different class because they're covering the same thing? And when it's being implemented well, is it achieving what was intended? And if so, what is our responsibility to support getting it implemented well? If it's not achieving its intention, then that's a different conversation, I think.
Can I just quickly comment on that? The educational system is really rigid, and the Carnegie units and all of that is really, and it's tough to open up the Pandora's box and try to do something different, but the whole was trying to really reach the whole person. What is it that a person needs to, survive today and as an adult and whatnot? And that's what, kind of the intent was, are we failing in terms of what students really need? But it certainly is a work in progress. That's
And as I looked at that, the sort of suggested, I forget what they're called, the AOE's really transferable skills and graduation sample proficiencies and indicators, like we would want every student to graduate with these set of skills demonstrated through core content or otherwise. So again, I am wholeheartedly supportive of the intention, and whether or not the State Board of Ed put a date certain or the law put a date certain, it's good that somebody did, because it's date certain time, and we see that it's varying in its implementation, and the law's been around for a really long time with ample opportunity to have maybe more universally have been implementing without feeling like it's an under the gun, we got to get it done for this group of kids who are graduating this year. This isn't a new law. So I guess
And I think we heard at our August meeting, if I recall correctly, a testimony from some of the groups that some districts that are well-resourced have been able to invest and target a lot of training and development for their staff, so the staff really are up to speed, and then other districts are either not well-resourced or frankly not very interested, and so that the rollout is very uneven. As you're all talking, this is such a pregnant topic. It's such a it just sort of feels to me like this board could easily and productively, I think, convene essentially some hearings on this topic ideally in 2 or 3 different parts of the state, and so some all-comers, come tell us what you know and think about how we're doing with proficiency-based learning, and from which we might be able to compile some impressions, some concerns, some commendations, which would be perhaps of interest to the agency, though my guess is that none of it would come as a surprise to them, and might be of interest to the General Assembly. And I guess what you might sense a theme for me is that one of our roles can be the eyes and ears of the General Assembly on how what they have created is working out, and what, if any, fine-tuning or resourcing might be called for, and that this board, as an independent entity with really no axe to grind other than supporting quality education, can provide a perspective that the General Assembly simply doesn't have time to do on their own. So,
I think you hit the nail on the head with the word uneven, right? Like,
yes.
So there's uneven implementation and resources for every initiative
Mm.
in all parts of the state.
Well, that is true.
So-
They pointed that out to us as well. Yep.
Right, and I think any group that comes before us, or we have these conversations, I think the unevenness is
Mhm.
pervasive. So I guess I think you can take this conversation from Kim's point, from in the classroom, what this looks like, all the way up to, that policy systems level
Mhm.
of who needs the most help and how do they get it, right?
Yeah.
Like, so if Kyle's school is clearly saying like, hey, we need the most help,
Right.
what is that system that kicks
Right.
in? And the NEA is presenting a report that says, we have some major problems here. What kicks in at that level to provide that support, and where
Right.
does that go?
Right.
And I don't know, and maybe Secretary gets that crisis moment for those schools, lands on your desk and your department, and is that a rules conversation, or is it an implementation, or is it a resource, right?
So the squishy piece is like, this is somewhere between that right now,
Mhm.
but the
Yeah.
2020
That's right.
data is certainly
Right.
in the rules, and that's
Yeah, I don't see it in the law.
causing some,
but-
that's a focus point of a lot.
Well, this is a good conversation, and it's certainly not the end. I think it's just the beginning. But in fairness to others who are here, we're 5 minutes behind. We'll give 15 minutes nonetheless to the public to be heard. Is there anybody from the public who wishes to be heard? Yes, if you would please.
I didn't sign in for that, but that's okay.
All right, if you'd please come to the table and identify yourself. Thank you.
Good morning, Jay Nichols, Vermont Principals Association, resident of Berkshire, Vermont. Just because you were talking about PBL, just a couple quick comments. One, just remember that tradition is peer pressure from dead people. Start with, okay? And
Wait
in
a
public
minute,
education, we bow to peer pressure all the time. 12 white guys, older guys, developed this curriculum for high schools in 1905 or 1895. Bill could give me the date. And that's driven, Carnegie Unit's driven how we do a lot of our work. So just want to keep that in mind. Jenna mentioned uneven implementation. Dan and I have talked about that before. John, you mentioned resources, both human resources, okay, level of expertise, skill set, those types of things, as well as financial resources are factors in this. So some places that have not implemented PBLs all that well may be resourced well, but might not have the human capital or the expertise to do it well. And then just want to mention 2 other things. First of all, entry points. There were really basically 3 different entry points. 2 are connected. One was personalized learning plans. So some places really leaned into personalized learning plans and maybe didn't spend a lot of time on what proficiency-based learning was really all about, or proficiency-based grading. Other places went the other route. This is a complex law that a lot had to happen in a relatively short period of time. Ideally, when you put a law in like that, what you'd do is you'd start with next year's kindergarten. And then it'd be next year's kindergarten and first grade. And then it would be kindergarten 1, 2, and so on. As opposed to saying, okay, all you kids that are now 10, 11, 12th graders, or you kids that are 7th and 8th graders, you've missed what we're saying, the core stuff you're supposed to have now. We'll find a way to backfill that somehow, which we typically don't, and then we'll move on from there. And then lastly, we need to keep in mind that Carnegie units and traditional grades have never been a good indicator of how well a student is learning essential content or their skills.
What has been a good indicator?
Typically, the good indicator has been really how motivated the kid is to do well, I think, for the most part. I think sometimes the transferable skills in the past have been left behind, and we've had plenty of kids who have not gone on to college, not been successful, because we've had that college for all mindset since the 70s or 80s that started kicking into place. Remember, before the 1950s, half the people in the United States did not go to college. We were more of a manufacturing society, and were for another 20, 30 years. Around the 80s and 90s, we started switching over to more of a digital-based, tertiary service-type society. So the skills that were necessary prior are not the skills that are necessary going forward. So just being good at science or math, I'd rather have somebody who was a creative problem solver, could think on their feet, had good people skills, and was a learner. That's more important. That's what companies are telling us in surveys over and over again. We can teach some of the basic skills that our company has, but what we need you to do, schools, is put out people that can collaborate, can work well with others, that have interpersonal skills, and that are willing to learn.
One of the reasons we didn't do elementary schools is because elementary schools have that more of that approach anyway.
A lot of them are already doing it. You're absolutely right. It's a lot easier for the elementary schools than it's been for the high schools, I can tell you that.
Any other, before you leave, any other questions?
I'm confused. Is Bill one of the 12 came up with the curriculum?
Jay, I guess I want to just double back on. The question that always comes to me is, how will we know it when we see it? How do we, so if we talk about somebody who's good at problem solving and good at all the other sort of qualitative descriptors that you use,
right.
If you have no way of assessing that it exists or doesn't exist in some sort of reasonably systematic way, then how do you know you're succeeding? And if you have no way of knowing you're succeeding, then that's a pretty troubling prospect to me. So I guess I wonder, what are your thoughts about how do we know it when we see it?
I think that's partly where the transferable skills come into play. And the different systems is set up differently. When I left Franklin Northeast, the way we had set it up was that a kid had to show proficiency in a transferable skill in 3 different settings. So if I was at the Career Center and I was a forestry student and I was showing a transferable skill around accepting responsibility and accountability for myself, I also had to be able to show that in 2 other places. So it wasn't that I could just do that in forestry, but maybe I also could do that in English class, and maybe I could also do that as a member of the drama club or whatever it might be. And so having like 3 different people verify that this kid indeed had demonstrated in different settings that he or she could show that transferable skill would allow us to say, okay, this kid is proficient, has a proficient skill set in that transferable skill. At the same time, it doesn't mean we're not grading for academics. Just that the way that we're grading for them is different. We had a curriculum coordinator in our system whose daughter went to one of our high schools, I won't mention which one, and she had a B+ in algebra 2, I think it was. Pretty high level math. And her mom said to her, what are you learning math already? She goes, I have no idea. I don't know any of the material at all. She says, you have a B+ on your report card. How can that be? She said, I do my homework every night. And so the mother looked for her homework book. The teacher was checking off that the kid did the homework. It was all done wrong, but the kid was doing the homework. And the test scores were all 40s and 50s. And the kid was getting a B+ because she played the game of school. And that's no good anymore. We don't want kids that play the game of school. We want it to be about the learning as opposed to trying to get the letter grade of an A or a B.
Thank you.
Can I just answer your question quickly and crudely? Bob Helms was in the appropriation committee, and this subject, he said, just listen to what the kids are saying in the quarters.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's true.
I bet you have a thought on this, Bill.
Yeah, I want to talk about the school level thing a little bit as contrasted with the student thing, because one's a subset of the other. Is that the word squishy is a word that's being used to talk about the reauthorization of the ESSA, which is coming up in a couple of years. And this gets to this point of you cannot quantify everything that's important. We still need the test scores and the things that we can collect that are uniform. But those things that are not quantifiable, we'd have to go to a judgment panel that you're talking of. And this gets back to ancient pragmatism as a formal philosophy in terms of that's the way that you make these decisions. And you have to get those teams that are going in And that's where the connection to the IFR comes in. That is the panel of people that make the judgments about the school in addition to the quantifiable things, and you don't try to add up the squishies because they don't add, they're not the same thing. But that's something I think we'll have to think about.
All right. Kim, yes.
I was just looking at the line, the 2000, or Rule 2000, but within the law, the one thing it says, and I appreciate the law came into effect in 2013, so not under your watch, Dan, but it specifically states the Secretary shall develop, publish, and regularly update guidance in the form of technical assistance, sharing of best practices, and model documents, legal interpretations, and other support designed to assist school districts to identify, there are several subcategories of things that the agency was to have been providing support to the field on, and to move in the direction of the support that might have there be more consistency in the guidelines. So I'm guessing that's more than the 2-page document on sample proficiencies. And I just didn't, again, that could very well have been happening. I just don't know that it has. I don't know to what extent it would be important for us to be checking in on that. Because it's within the law, and is it happening? Has it happened? And if so, why hasn't it been embraced by the field? Is it not happening in a way it's accessible, for instance? So, again, add it to my list of questions because I think this topic is timely and important if the intentions of this are to be effective for students.
Yeah. I mean, the language of the statute itself is a bit squishy, providing support. What does that mean? Does it mean that agency staff go out and train people, or does it mean that it provides guidance and documents?
Are you reading statutory language there, or?
I was reading statutory language. So,
Which statute?
This is 77.
The law itself?
It's-
I was wondering. Yeah,
I'm on the law.
The act.
An act relating to encouraging flexible pathways to secondary school completion, section S-130. I don't know how to read these things. So.
Okay, yeah, so we'll have to.
So I'm just under Flexible Pathways Initiative, and it's fairly prescriptive. Develop, publish, and regularly update guidance in the form of technical assistance, sharing of best practices and model documents, legal interpretations, and other support designed to, so the very trailing end of that is, I think, more open to interpretation. The other is fairly prescriptive. And again, I know it's been since 2013, so I don't know if we have any sense of what has been provided in that regard.
Yes. Yeah, no, actually, yeah, we can do that. I was, to Bill's question, a lot of that language is in the 940 section of Title 16. So there's a flexible pathways section in Title 16, 942.
Okay.
And part of it's, a little bit's under your duties in 165. But yeah, so it's.
I want to borrow your
Yeah, I think somewhere around 942-ish, you'll find it talks more about the flexible pathways language that Kim was because there are three components, and proficiency is one of them. The other is flexible pathways and personalized learning plans.
There's one contradiction
I just
in
section
law.
941.
941. I was seeing how good you were.
That was close.
There you
Yeah.
go. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that was to my earlier point. We'd be, the agency certainly has that information. But I think if you've taken, I would say some testimony, but you've heard from some perspectives on that. If you're interested in hearing others, I would just say I've encountered the Terrence who have, a really an interesting statewide perspective, and also it might be useful to hear from the guidance counselors. So that's a perspective I hadn't really encountered before until I.
Very good. Good conversation. You're now eating into your own break time. We will convene at 10, reconvene at 10. Thank you all for coming. And to any other visitors and guests, I'm reminded to remind you to please use the sign-in sheet that's over on the table where all the documents are. I think you all have. Thank you. Please introduce yourselves and begin your presentation.
Sure. Thanks. Good morning, everyone. I'm Megan Roy. I'm the chair of the Census-Based Funding Advisory Group.
And I'm Marilyn Mahesky. I am, I think, the vice chair of the Census-Based Funding Advisory Group.
Nicole Mace. I am a member of the Census-Based Advisory Group.
And Jay Nichols, I'm a member of the Sensory.
Thank you. We are at your disposal.
Great. So we're here to share with you some recommendations coming out of the advisory group. I think, too, that I would just add that each one of us sits on the advisory group representing our professional organization. So if there's a point at which we're answering questions with that hat, we'll let you know. But this presentation is representing the consensus opinion of the advisory group. So we will do just a little bit of background. Your board is quite familiar with this, but I think it is helpful.
Jay, could you swing that so it's more visible to the board?
Oh, thanks. We think it's helpful to give a little bit of the background around Act 173 and the charge of our group, because it's very connected to the recommendations that the group came out with. We're going to review kind of the advisory group's input into the rulemaking process so far, and then we'll talk about our preliminary recommendations. And there's slides, but people can just interrupt, ask questions, and obviously we'll have time to discuss at the end. So in terms of Act 173, these two priorities are quoted from the law, and they're very connected to what the advisory group has been discussing. So two broad priorities of 173. First is to enhance the effectiveness, availability, and equity of services provided to all students who require additional support in Vermont schools. And in order to support the delivery of these services, the state funding model for special education will provide more flexibility in how the funding can be used, is aligned with the state's policy priorities of servicing students who require additional support, and will simplify administration. So that's directly from Act 173. So just a quick overview. If you were to drill 173 down, there's two main points. One is it changes the funding model. It replaces the current reimbursement model of special education funding to a census-based grant, so a per-student grant calculation. The intention is that funds will be used flexibly and can be used across a school's multi-tiered system of supports for struggling learners. And the funding model ensures that we maintain alignment with federal reporting requirements and maintenance of effort, which we'll talk about a little bit later. On the programmatic side, it is also reinforcing some existing legislation, and I would say heightening the emphasis on schools' requirement to develop multi-tiered systems of supports for students who are struggling. It takes into account recommendations that came out of the district management group study from a number of years ago, and 4 of those recommendations we need to make sure, or districts, schools, need to make sure that classroom instruction meets most needs of most kids. So that's first instruction. It has a strong and clear emphasis on literacy, developing systems of social emotional learning supports, and it emphasizes, or the district management group recommendations emphasize that we need teachers to be providing intervention in addition to strong classroom instruction. So the advisory group has 3 main charges, and again, you folks know this, but the first of which is to advise you all on the development of rules necessary to implement the act. The second is to advise the agency and supervisory unions on implementation, and to make any recommendations to the General Assembly about any statutory changes that might be necessary. And so far, we've, over the past 2 years, focused on the rule, advising the rulemaking process and advising the agency on the programmatic piece, which is that this charge of advising around implementation. So that's been the bulk of our work, although we did recommend to the General Assembly a delay last year, and I'll talk about that in a moment. We've met 11 times so far, as I said, focused primarily on those 2 areas. We did report to the General Assembly that there's a link here, which doesn't help you because you're not looking at it electronically, but it is on the website and other places. We can get you a copy of that. And these folks will jump in whenever if I miss things or anything like that. I'm going to leave this slide up for a while. There's quite a bit of talking points underneath in terms of what our work has been to date. We started our work last fall with the idea that we would have a subcommittee of the advisory group working specifically with the agency on the development of rules. That subcommittee was asked to give input to the agency about what parts of the special ed rules should be or required revision to implement Act 173. The agency presented a proposed rule structure for input. At the time, their proposed approach, and they've kind of continued that, is to limit the scope of revisions for the bulk of the special ed rules, with the exception of the funding chapter. Their recommendation was to pull out the chapter on funding and create a standalone set of rules to address that. And that they would address the funding of independent schools within that funding chapter. So that was the approach that they presented to us, and we had a chance to give input. We had a lot of discussion at our January meeting last year about special education funding for independent schools. But we were, again, operating without a draft, so we weren't reacting to anything. We were sort of giving input and having discussions about how to approach that one part of it. In February, the agency gave us an initial draft. I would describe that as an outline, and they would describe that as well when they presented it to us. It was sort of a framework of what the funding chapter would look like, as opposed to draft language. In March, they gave us a more substantive draft, and the way that they presented that at our March meeting, and made some specific requests about how to receive the input to that. They wanted to receive it individually from members as representatives of our organization, so that was done in writing to them. So, one of the things that you'll hear us talk about is, the goal of this group is to work, hopefully collaboratively, to be able to have substantive discussions. Sometimes it's hard to do that when we're reading a draft for the first time. And so we did have some discussion at that meeting, but we were operating off of, kind of the first time we had read through the rules or the draft. In April, the agency, this is the point at which the advisory group did have a chance to talk as a group about that March draft. And the group began a discussion about delay. Actually probably touched on the idea of a delay prior to April, but April was when we were thinking about that more specifically, because there just wasn't a lot of daylight available to have discussions around rule drafts. And the agency was clear with us in the beginning. They were operating on the very tight timeline that was specified in 173. And the advisory group was concerned about the speed of that timeline, and a lot of things at that point were still in draft form. A lot of discussion was had about things that would be in rule versus things that would be in guidance, but guidance wasn't developed yet. And so it was just hard to give input in that structure. So hence the advisory group's recommendation for a delay. In May, we had an advisory group meeting. At this point, the draft of the rules had gone to the state board. This is what the agency had shared with us. And so from their perspective, the input was to go to you as the state board at that point, not to the agency, because they had submitted an initial draft. And again, just reinforcing, that made it, the advisory group still had substantive questions and concerns, weren't really sure who to direct those to. And at various times, we've said, some of this is repeating. We've sort of come to you a few different times, so you've heard pieces of this, and sorry for the repeat. But because of that, we're sitting in May. We knew we would have a meeting in July. We didn't have a lot of substantive information, but we had a lot of concern around kind of initial interpretations that the agency was discussing with us. And it caused us, and we were sort of at a place where, well, now we're not quite, we don't have a lot of information to go on. We were being told that the time to give input, at least at that point, was sort of closed. And so there was a need to look for additional information. So separate from the advisory group, the four Vermont organizations, the NEA, thank you, the NEA, the VSBA, the VPA, VCSEA, VSA, thank you, that's 5, sought external advice around just initial drafts, initial discussions, and all of that information was shared at the July meeting. So there's a presentation by the Federal Education Group, this report you're familiar with, and members of our organization spoke to you just a couple of your meetings ago, and they really presented quite a bit of information to suggest that we should be slowing down and really rethinking what the interpretation is. So try to highlight some of the things that report shared, because they're factored into our recommendations. But the first thing is from the perspective of the Federal Education Group. The state's definition of an approach to special education is narrower than the federal IDEA. And I'm using a lot of acronyms, so if anyone needs, that's the federal special ed law. And it's narrow enough that it potentially conflicts with federal law. This was the perspective of the group. It's the perspective of FEG that the federal law permits school districts and other agencies to spend Part B funds on a broader array of things than is written into the state's interpretation. And that the law, Act 173, does permit districts to use funds on students not identified for special education. We know that we can't use that to demonstrate maintenance of effort, which is a federal requirement that we'll kind of explain in more depth. But there wasn't a need to restrict how we use the funding in order for us to make sure we document maintenance of effort correctly. There is not an actual need to have the same set of rules for those two things. And that federal law offers opportunities to reduce the administrative burden. So in a sense, the Federal Education Group, their analysis reinforced a lot of the questions that the Census-Based Funding Advisory Group had about the current draft set of rules. And so you folks had an opportunity to read that. I know the agency has read that and kind of digested the report.
The agency, also, small team met with the Federal Education Group in a pre-conversation before the report was presented to the advisory group in order to give them heads up and also opportunity to ask questions and better understand the conclusions of the report.
Yes, thank you. So then in September and October, we've had two meetings this school year, starting this school year. In September, the advisory group saw a draft set of rules that was presented to the group from the Disability Law Project. You all have a copy of that draft set of rules because it's on the Census-Based Funding Advisory Group. And the intention was that we would spend September discussing that draft. The draft incorporated recommendations from the Federal Education Group as well as the concerns of the advisory group. Because the goal, I should remind you that in July, the State Board of Ed asked us to be prepared to come to you this fall with substantive recommendations including draft language if we were recommending different language. And so these meetings in September and October and this draft were to prepare us to do that. So we discussed in September a set of rules. And we're going to talk about what's incorporated in those rules. The discussion, there is wide agreement on the Census-Based Advisory Committee on the concepts that those rules included. And when I say wide, I mean there really aren't dissenting opinions at this point around what is in these drafts. Go ahead.
Which drafts?
So around the concepts that are in the Disability Law Project draft that you see. But the group, so the discussion in September, assumption that we would have a motion to adopt some recommended rules with revisions in October. But in that intervening time, we understood, what we found out in September is that the agency does have a revised draft from the one we've all been operating under that incorporated their read of the Federal Education Group. And we had some preliminary discussions about what was in that draft, but it wasn't prepared, it wasn't ready for the advisory group to see in its entirety.
Are you talking about a new draft since the one we received
Yes.
in July?
Yes.
Draft 2.
Right. But we
Okay.
haven't seen that yet.
We've just seen a couple of us have seen a sort of a side-by-side document that shows the disability law projects, the AOE's original rules, the disability law projects language, and an AOE response. But that was not shared with the advisory group. I was able to see it, I think, the day or two before the meeting of the advisory group.
Right. And go ahead.
And so I just want to say, so I think that fact that the advisory group didn't get a chance to see it was really part of the reason we decided the advisory group didn't vote in favor of the rules, recommending the DLP version of the rules to this group, as we felt like that would be premature to actually take a vote and say this is what this group is in favor of, in part because we felt we needed, as a group, to see the agency's responses and to have further conversation about that and try to merge the differences, because I think we all wanted to come forward with a consensus. And that was clear at the end of the last meeting, is that people felt we should try to have a consensus to give to this body. But because of the timing of things, we haven't had an opportunity to have that conversation with the now 3 drafts of the rules.
Right.
But as I understand it, what you're presenting to us today, which is based only on the first draft,
yes,
is a consensus document
Yes.
of the advisory group.
that is correct.
So you have consensus based upon what you've received so far from the agency.
Right.
Well,
What we have consensus around is the
I'm
recommendations.
sorry, you have consensus on your recommendations,
Not,
which were based upon what you have so far received from the agency, which is the draft from the summer.
yes, and I'll finish kind of drawing the through line between September and October. So because we didn't have the opportunity as an advisory group to officially see any second draft from the agency and to officially hear their perspective on the second draft, the same organizations who had initially contracted with the Federal Education Group sought additional input from that group, because we were sort of left with, we have our draft that conceptually we very much agree with, but we don't have the benefit of the agency's perspective, at least not officially. So we had more questions. And so those organizations sought input, just very cursory input from FEG about that, about the Disability Law Project draft, and what the result of that reaching out for information is. They continue to have the same concerns that I outlined here about the agency's connecting different funding constructs and restrictions. And I'm going to talk about that in more detail. I keep saying that. But they also had questions about the draft itself and some of the technical language in the draft that you see. And it has to do with the fact that it's covering multiple different funding requirements and how you can spend those dollars. It was not at that point an in-depth analysis, but it gave the Census-Based Funding Advisory Group enough pause to say we're not ready to adopt that set of rules. But we very much agree on a set of priorities and recommendations that I'm going to share with you right now.
The purpose of sharing the Disability Law Project rules with you at this point is, number one, they're out there on the website, so you should probably see them. And so you know that we've been hard at work. We haven't been ignoring your request. It's just we want to get it right. And when I shared the Disability Law Project's draft with Federal Education Group, they raised some concerns about some of the provisions within it because we carried forward language from the agency's original draft that says a single set of rules will apply to multiple funding streams. And they say that is the wrong approach to take. And I'll talk a little bit more about what now.
Yeah.
But that's why you have that language in front of you, but that has not been adopted by the advisory group because some flags were raised by the folks that we consider to be experts, that we've brought in as experts on the topic.
Yep.
And who do this work every day.
Right. Questions on timeline or process before because the next thing that we will talk about is our preliminary recommendations. So are there any questions about timeline? Yeah, Bill.
There's the draft that the agency had put together. There's your recommendations that you're going to be talking about. And then there's another set, a later set of agency recommendations that you haven't seen or used.
That's right.
It's an agency draft, is it not?
Our understanding is that it's a draft. We don't know.
Can we get some, can you give us any clarity on this?
Yeah, I tried to bring this to your attention earlier that, you know, we have found the Federal Education Group input valuable, and we're in the process of reacting to that. But and I'm on the advisory group, the timeline for the advisory group as established by this board required them to move forward, and I'll let the chair and or vice chair speak for the group, but there was a tension there, I think, in the group to make sure that they still responded to you at the same time we're trying to digest and react to the FEC group. So I've been sort of overtly saying that we are in the process of reevaluating some key assumptions based on that, but we haven't had the chance to inform the advisory group on that regard, but they are still on a timeline that the board has set to produce recommendations to you.
So I guess my question is simply, when will you have your final proposed draft available to the advisory group?
What we did and I don't want to preempt their conversation, I think they can go further into it, but what we did at the last meeting was take it down to that level of guidance around cost documentation, which for me, as secretary, was very useful to go back, as I expected it would, inform our assumptions on the rules. So what my recommendation was to the group at the last meeting was that give us 30 days to kind of digest that and come up with some reaction. So I would expect November to at least to have some of the key principles nailed down. I think we're down to the kernel of understanding. And it is, from my perspective, similar. The question, we have two funding streams, I would argue, the block grant and the federal funding. The block grant, as anticipated on 173, is to be used more flexibly. Questionable, I would say less flexibly, the federal funds to be deployed. The question is, how do we satisfy maintenance of effort for both of those things? And to what extent a single set of rules would be useful, not necessarily required, but useful to ensure maintenance of effort and appropriate use of federal funds, in particular, in a diverse educational delivery system such as Vermont's. So I think where we ended up in our guidance document was if we start as an entry point, maintenance of effort, I think it's going to help us get back to that essential question, and I'm not convinced we're internally working on it, that a single set of rules would be useful per se. So back to that, sort of central question, I think we're on track to answer that more clearly. I won't say satisfactorily, but more clearly. But it would be important on the theme of, and this is the central theme here, I think, is of getting this right as opposed to trying to follow a pre-described timeline that was really established before the FEG report was even created. So I would support, as a member of the advisory group and as secretary, to give us, at least a little more time to get down to the kernel of truth, if you will, on these issues.
I guess I'm needing to keep this very simple in my mind, and that is to ask, so when will there be a revised final draft of the rules from the agency?
I would say November, we would present something to the advisory group. I'm not sure if you're asking when it would come back to you. I'm not sure. I think what we're striving to do at this point is to get closer to consensus with the advisory group before we present something back to you.
What does the law say? Aren't you folks supposed to advise the secretary and the state board both?
Right. That's correct.
And you have a deadline, a new deadline that's more flexible, if you will. You, I believe, have to begin rulemaking by August 2020. Part of what drove this before was a really aggressive timeline. It wasn't, you had to have the process launched. So we feel there's still a window of opportunity to try to work through some of these highly complex issues. So.
Well, we can come back to the board's own timeline, but the timeline we visualize does not leave us until August to start the rulemaking process. Because if we start that late, we'll cut very close to the end target stipulated by statute. I think the board wants to see final drafts from the agency not later than the end of the year. The agency's final statement of where it thinks the rules need to be, so that there's then time for public comment and for comment by the advisory group, with the idea that we would begin the 8-month rulemaking process by April. It's true that we could wait until August, but that leaves us no time on the back end.
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting we'd go that far, but I would just.
So, in order for the board to have adequate time to hear commentary, not just of the advisory group, but to conduct some public hearings of its own, before it adopts its rules to go into the rulemaking process, we need to hear from, we need to sort of close the door around the end of the year at the latest and say, speak now or forever hold your peace, because now we've got to take this thing and take it public and find out what changes we should make before we make it ours.
You're talking calendar year.
Before the end of this calendar year. So that's why I'm pressing about when will the agency complete its final draft. I understand all the consultation you want to do and all that, but in the end, I think if there's a final draft is not to us by December, then number one, it's hard to understand why it should be any later than that. And number two, I think that runs the risk of collapsing the public process that the board wants to go through.
Yeah, I think it's, I would just comment, I would agree, we're on that trajectory, but my guiding principle now is to try to do this right. What I've suggested to the advisory group, one of the areas of consensus I would like to work with them on this year is by December, understanding, if we have better clarity on the scope of this project and the work involved, we would come to consensus in December on any further statutory changes. I was speaking with the legislative committees last year. I said every year we will be coming to you with recommendations on potential modifications to the law as we work through this complex and technical policy. So to the extent that the deadlines now seem firm, if this was part of a barrier, in my view, to us achieving good policy, I would be recommending to the legislature to modify those timelines accordingly so the work could go forward in a better quality way. But I think currently, yes, I feel like we're really close to answering some essential questions, much closer than we were 60 days ago. And the FEG report's been very helpful in that regard.
So, John, just a couple things to add to this conversation. And the first thing that I'll say is related to the continued concern of the advisory group that causes us to, you'll see, recommend more formally, that we seek external thoughts on that. The other thing that was presented in September, as Dan shared, was the draft of the cost documentation. So this is the guidance document that would underpin the rules. And the cost documentation, which, to Dan's point, was developed based on their original draft, right?
Slightly modified.
Slightly
They had some
modified,
changes
yep.
to the test.
Yes, that's right. But the entire guidance document is based on an interpretation that the advisory group has concerns with that we're going to share. And so the signals that we're receiving, and I would even say, so now taking off the chair hat because the advisory group has not seen this, but the preliminary side-by-side that as the VCSEA rep I have seen, both of those things together are signaling that there has not been a shift in the agency's interpretation. And I hear that I'm saying this in advance of seeing their next draft, so I will recognize that. But it is concerning enough to the advisory group that our strong recommendation is to continue to have external support, because we're not necessarily seeing in print, and we haven't seen it yet, so I want to respect that, but we are not seeing any signals that there's a shift, and it's concerning to the group, and that has to do with our recommendation. And then the second piece, just to kind of reinforce, one of the things that I think has made it hard for the advisory group is we see things for the first time at a meeting and are asked to give input to them kind of live. And what we have created is we don't think that's, that doesn't give us the ability to seek input from our organizations. It doesn't even really give us the ability as individuals representing our organizations to digest it. So in this timeline, if we are going to see a second revision from the agency in November, we won't have a substantive discussion on it until our December meeting. And I just want to acknowledge that in terms of your timeline. We too would like to have a productive single draft that comes to you, but that's where we are. But I think that the concern that the advisory group has about the continued interpretation has a lot to do with our recommendations. So I can move to that if now feels like a good time to do that.
Okay.
Yep, Bill.
Getting hold of the issues is something that's important to do, and I don't feel that we've done that. And maintenance of effort, are you going to get to that?
Yep.
Okay, I'm just wondering why that's such a big bugaboo.
You're going to find out. Okay. So there are 4 recommendations here, and this is how we've sort of structured them. Is to talk a little bit about the agency's proposal. And in this case, it's always the agency's draft that exists right now, which I know is not the more recent one. We're going to outline what our concerns are and what our recommendation is. The other thing that John very accurately shared at our September meeting is that some of this, especially maintenance of effort, is a highly technical part of calculating special ed funding. And we recognize that it's difficult for those of us that are immersed in it, let alone people that aren't. So we made an attempt to try to help define those constructs. We'll do our best, but please ask questions. And but again, that is also part of why we think it's important to be very well advised through this. So our first recommendation is about the definition of special education. So in the agency's proposal, their draft set of rules maintains an existing definition of special education that has been in Vermont rule for a long time that restricts special ed services and therefore allowable expenditures, because in Vermont those two things are the same thing, restricts it to those services that are not provided within a school's typical system of support, which means that if there's a service happening in a school, like a reading interventionist that works with lots of kids, that is considered a something available to all students, and in Vermont that cannot be considered a special education service. The concern on the part of the advisory group is that is an unnecessarily restrictive definition. That restriction doesn't exist in federal law. And so this phrase, this italicized phrase, that cannot be provided within the school's standard instructional conditions or provided through the school's educational support system, that's in our current rule. That's the phrase that the advisory group has concerns with. Because we think it limits the ability of an IEP team, so individual education plan, that's the team that creates these legal documents. It limits their ability to select services and supports that may be necessary for that student. And it has the potential to restrict the ability of a school to provide special ed services in the least restrictive environment, which means in, ideally, a child's classroom. That inclusive part is really central to Vermont education, and I think that's concerning to us. So the advisory group recommendation is to adopt the federal definition of special education services that's defined in federal law, and to not have this additional piece that says it's only services that are above and beyond the school's standard system of support.
And is this restriction in effect that because funding is not available for these services, that they are therefore not made available to the student?
Well, I think sometimes that's the result. So in a reimbursement model that we've been living in, what it means is that a district won't get reimbursed for that services of that reading specialist who's working with that student on an IEP. That could be described as just a funding issue, but in reality, that is impacting decision-making that an IEP team makes.
That's creating an incentive to...
Correct.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And if I put on my advocacy hat for a minute, because that's what I do, is, I mean, that could be a violation of federal law. Mm-hmm. So if a decision is made to restrict the delivery of a service to a child, because there's this backdoor funding restriction, then we could be violating that child's right to a free and appropriate public education under federal law. So it's really important, and this actually was a recommendation that my group was proposing all along, and has been wanting to change the definition of special education for a long time, is that it is restrictive, and it does conflict with federal law. And under, our system of government, the states cannot pass laws that are more restrictive than the federal requirements, and that's what's happened here. So we are out of compliance with federal law, I believe, in our current operation.
Statute or in rule?
Rule.
It's
Rule.
I would add to both of your comments that it may have, it's not always the fact that services are denied, it's that the best services for that child's disability are not offered because in lieu of a para-educator, perhaps, delivering instruction, because that position is reimbursable, but that person is not the best person to deliver, research-based instruction that addresses that child's particular learning disability.
Most appropriate. I would say most appropriate, as defined by FAPE.
Well, and the district management group report showed that we have this pattern of identifying supports for students through a paraprofessional who is not necessarily trained in the type of instruction that the student with a disability needs, and the focus on first instruction and emphasis on literacy should cause us all to want to ensure IEPs and resources are targeting best practice, which this definition sometimes limits teams from doing.
The IEP team, are they capable of really managing this in the full integrated delivery model? I mean, is it all rest within the IEP team to establish this?
Well, I would say that the decision-making about what an individual child needs is done by an IEP team. That's sort of defined by law, but that IEP team is making decisions in the context of a school system and what services they have.
And that's what I'm trying to get, the difference between the regular ed and the special ed. I think we're trying to get a more integrated model.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
There's absolutely training and technical assistance
Right.
that's going to be needed to support folks who sit on IEP teams,
Yep.
LEA reps, families. I mean, there's a host of
Yeah.
mindset changes that I think need to be. But before we can get there, we need to get the rules right.
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 And so this rule restricts you as a principal. This rule right here makes
In
it so
terms
it's
of-
hard to take your best people.
In terms of how to finance
Put
it.
them in the
yeah.
right spots.
Yep.
And what the UVM study highlighted was sort of a flip of this, was that schools are over-identifying students in order to get the services, because the services don't exist otherwise.
And potentially this then dictates a staffing switch as well, like a shift, because schools sometimes have
Getting rid of this is right in line with what DMG is telling us we should do.
Right.
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 This language.
Because not every school has reading specialists.
Right.
Right.
But
Yep.
they may have
But they-
10 paraeducators.
Right, but that you
That's
could.
right.
Yes.
At what level do you have to show a maintenance of effort? Is this at an IEP level, a school level, a district level, or a state?
We're going to get
We're
to
gonna get
that,
to that.
exact question.
We have a slide.
Promise, Bill.
I'm here to get
It's important,
Before
it's
lunch.
important to understand this in order to get to that.
Do you know how old this is? I mean, I'm just wondering, what, how old is this language?
Oh, as long as I've been
Oh,
practicing, which
prior-
has been
yeah.
over 25 years.
How long is Margaret Shelley with Margaret Shelley at Daily?
Right.
I'm wondering, so when you make
Yes.
the contention, it's contrary to federal law, it's been there for a while.
It's been there. It's
Yeah.
been in it has been in there a while, and nobody's actually challenged it. But that doesn't
Right.
mean that.
No,
it's,
no, I just wanted to
Yeah.
just point out that it's been there for a while.
Yeah.
Well,
it has
again,
been.
because our pattern is to over-identify students. We're not in the habit of denying services.
Right.
We're just in the habit of giving kids services that don't work very well.
And the other piece I would highlight here is, and the reason we started with this definition of special education is because everything else stems from this. It's one of the things that FEG identified in their report is the interpretation of how we can spend even IDEA-B funds, those are direct federal funds, well, they're not direct, but they're federal funds, is also restricted because of this definition of special education, because how we can spend those dollars is defined by how it's written in the IEP, and the definition of special education impacts this. So this is an important through line through the whole thing. And you'll notice in the 4 recommendations, there's lots of overlap. And a lot of it comes back down to this.
So number 1 is follow the federal law.
Yes. Okay, so now maintenance of effort, Bill. So in the current drafts that the advisory group has seen, the agency's drafts apply the current Vermont definition of allowable costs related to that definition of special education to documentation of MOE, so maintenance of effort under the census-based model. So maintenance of effort in layman's terms is the requirement that districts have. There's 2 levels. There's state maintenance and there is local maintenance of effort. And local maintenance of effort requires a district to be able to demonstrate that they spent at least as many dollars in support of students on IEPs as they did the previous year, with some exceptions. Sometimes very high-cost students move out of the district or they graduate. Sometimes staff retire who were at the top of the salary schedule and they're replaced by. So there are some things that there are exceptions to it, but by and large, you have to make sure you're not decreasing the money you spend in support of special education. That is what maintenance of effort is. And to date, how you calculate maintenance of effort, so how you count, how you demonstrate that you have made this, is all connected to the definition of allowable cost, which is related to the definition of special education services. And again, I'm going to be repeating this on several slides, but what's happened right now, maintenance of effort is a documentation requirement. It is meant so that you can ensure that you're not spending dollars that should be spent on kids on IEPs in other ways. It comes from a very important place. It's its own construct, though. And what has happened historically is flexibility in how we use state and local funds has been synonymous with how we calculate, this is historically, how we calculate maintenance of effort. And those 2 constructs, and there's a third construct of how you actually spend federal dollars. That's a district's IDEA-B grant. This idea that there needs to be a single set of rules for all three of those is applying the most restrictive definition to all three. And when we do that, it eliminates the flexibility in how you use state and local funds, which doesn't have to be the same way that you document maintenance of effort. So, questions on what maintenance of effort is? Yep.
If you have maintenance of effort, that means you can't save money, because you have to stay at the same
Yeah, except
level.
there's five ways, and that was very good, Summer. I mean, I've been struggling with this too, but there's 5 ways. There's 5 things you can do in federal law to not spend as much, and we have to know those 5 things really well to navigate Act 173. So Megan alluded to a couple of them. They are directly attached to child count numbers, so that's like the big one. So if the number of children who qualify for special education goes down, and that's an area going to be interest of the UVM study, because in particularly in emotional disturbance, the UVM study suggests that we over-identify 3 times as many students in that area as relative to our New England peers. So the number of students, number of staff, which is directly related to the number of students, one would think. Extraordinary cost changes or changes to an IEP that impact extraordinary costs. Long-term contracts that expire, such as owning a building or leasing equipment. And then the 5th one would be the SEA, or the state taking over the cost for something from a local, meaning we could run a state-level program. So those 5 things are going to become really, really important as we figure out the 173.
Okay, at the district or state level, you do all of your IEPs, you look at and see what that cost you, subtract the 5 out and make sure that that's greater than last year's.
We have a
right?
worksheet that we have to develop.
But that's the concept.
That's the concept. It's like supplanting. You know, it's the same exact concept as supplanting in CFP granting.
Well, I can't see what the problem is.
No, it's straightforward. But the point is, I think what I've realized is starting with MOE to impact I'm interested in the historical narrative. You know, once again, where the FEG group comes in evaluating our laws from just a clinical sort of compliance function, where regulation and rules come into play is someone has to determine how to apply the federal rule to our context. My hypothesis would be, from an anthropological standpoint, if you will, is because MOE has been the primary sort of lens through which the AOE's implemented IDEA. And if you're going to do reimbursement model, then you have to make sure you can do MOE. How do you do that? You create very restrictive processes so that you can do that bookkeeping at the end of the process.
Won't the local district have to pay any shortage?
So under the federal rules, the locals could pay back, but the SEA ultimately has to pay back, but the SEA has the ability to delegate that liability to the locals.
We've noticed.
Another little tweak in the rules. So our concern would be, and this is what the problem we have to solve essentially, is how much. I would agree that we've conflated the issue of flexibility on one funding source with the restrictive requirements of IDEA B funding, but how much flexibility or how much rope can we give locals to potentially violate MOE? So I think there's a way to ensure, if we start with the MOE and we can get some clear process around MOE, we can then feel more comfortable about employing a more flexible funding stream under the block
One thing we
grant.
did hear you say earlier was.
we're literally thinking out loud to show you where we are.
Earlier, you made a comment that definitely coincides with my thinking. You were saying how you're starting to come to the, I don't know if realization is the right word, but thinking that one rule is not going to serve each of these 3 pots. So
Yeah, I mean, in my approach on this was to the point about where the rules are. I wanted to take it down to the guidance level to see what it actually manifests itself. And I think that was why the last meeting for me was very useful, because we could react to, well, okay, if we do this, here are the definitions, what does that produce? Okay, it produces something that now lets us see this larger issue. So,
How does the funding formula impact this going from student to census base?
I don't understand.
Well, in other words, everything to date has been based on what the students need and what we've expended.
Reimbursement model. So we reimburse.
But you're reimbursing based on your total student count.
Not on count, it's based on the cost of an individual program.
It's a possible cost shift is what it is. So if you're in a district that's under the census block grant calculation is
Right.
going to receive less state funds, you still have to spend the money, you're just gonna do it with local funds.
Well, that's.
I mean, that, in some cases.
Well, that's-
That could be a problem, but to your question,
opposite
what we do now, we do this thing called service plan. And Randy's in the audience, she's a sped director in the area. So one of Randy's responsibilities this time of year is to produce a service plan, which is to look at all the student IEPs in our district and all the costs associated with those IEPs and predict for us at the state level how much it's gonna cost.
And it's only a prediction, because
It's
you
a
don't know
prediction.
until you've done it.
But that's how we generate sort of the projection of the cost, so it's based on individual student programs. The block grant, as Nicole's referring to, works totally different than that.
Well, I think it's important too, if we go back and take a look at the FEG report, one of the things that they said is that, and I think to your point, Dan, is that from a historical perspective, the state has been looking at maintenance of effort in a very narrow way where you need to document all of this, and it's become very technical. But what FEG is saying is that a different way to look at it would be to determine what percentage of children, for example, you have in a district that are receiving special education services, say it's 20%, you can meet maintenance of effort by carving out 20% of your census-based funding block. So you don't necessarily have to detail every expenditure in order to meet that maintenance of effort requirement. Now, I understand the agency's gonna want some record keeping, some way to be able to, that they can monitor and comply that districts are doing that properly. But based on what FEG is saying is we don't need that level of detail in order to meet the maintenance of effort requirement. So, it's kind of like that was a big eye-opener for me to say is that, wow, we could really approach this from a very different angle than we have historically.
Will the governance change in terms of 46 help in this process at all?
Well,
In terms of drawing from a broader base?
Certainly can't hurt.
Right, and
Because, yeah, you could, because you can move people around easier and
Correct.
stuff like that.
Yes.
And I would-
Certainly there's advantages there.
I would say as speaking with my hat as a special ed director in a system who has consolidated, we have far more of an ability to share resources, as Jay said, to build capacity with a bigger whole, to create a construct where we're creating more expert services, so less of a reliance on paras. So I do think the two are connected. Implementing 46 is a heavy lift, and implementing 173 is a heavy lift. So
Oh,
Well, that centralization was 153.
yeah.
It wasn't
Correct.
146, so that was.
I'm just concerned about.
Okay.
And we can take more time if we need.
Yeah.
Well, I think the next two slides are actually quite quick.
Let me just follow up on this slide though.
Okay.
So the advisory group recommendation.
Yep.
Do you have any idea what this external legal opinion would produce for a recommendation?
Can I hold that question until our last because this recommendation is essentially, it's almost like I have 4 slides for 3 recommendations.
One more question.
But I wanted to connect them to specific issues.
If you got a maintenance of effort requirement in a census-based system, why would you need state bureaucracy at all?
Well, that's access, no, we also have, it's not just, the census is only one funding stream. We also have IDEA B, which is a federal funding stream. So there's multiple
Okay.
funding streams.
Right.
Even if we just had the census, we still have to do the modeling and the calculation. And what other states are doing for MOE is doing a maintenance of effort calculator for their LEAs. So we would produce that based on their prior data. We'd basically doing sort of a service plan model for you, as opposed to you generating it yourself.
The other point, sorry. The other just point I'd like to make in terms of the through line is that this calculation also keys off the definition of special education. Because what services can you count towards your maintenance of effort
precisely.
calculation depend on what services are allowed to be delivered as part of a special education program.
Right,
And if you're limiting it to only those services that are not part of the school's instructional program, then you're narrowing the
Yes.
slice of
This broadens
activities
the-
that can
the
be
base.
used to count toward maintenance.
You're making it harder
Except,
to
as what
demonstrate.
Marilyn said, there's multiple methodologies for maintenance of effort.
Right.
And not all of them include a cost documentation.
Right.
So we could maintain the onerous, horrible inflexibility but shift maintenance effort to a broader percentage and still satisfy
I
maintenance.
thought that was the idea. was
Maybe.
to-
That's not what
That's not what we're looking for, Dan. That's not what we're looking
I know.
for.
Just to say though, there are some
And that is a
options.
given, but the intent of the law is what we're-
Correct.
Well,
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
I just want to be clear.
Okay.
So some of the things on this slide are very much related to what we've already talked about. But this talks about a specific element of it that is problematic, even at the moment problematic. So again, maintaining the existing definition is the proposals, is in the current proposed rules. And that definition is now being applied, I would say differently than it has been in the past on a specific slice of allowable expenditure, which is when students are attending independent special education schools. In the past, those schools, those placements, because they're written into kids' IEPs, they are, an IEP team is who places the student there, they are considered eligible costs. This definition of special education services restricts and causes districts to need to separate out the general education portion of a special education, approved special education independent school. And the concerns of the advisory group are this doesn't take into account the highly specialized nature of independent special education schools. So when an IEP team determines that they can't meet the needs of a child in their home school and they are choosing an approved special education school, they're doing that because everything about the delivery in that special education school, including the delivery of general education, is specialized. Because if it weren't specialized, we could do it in our own schools. When I say we, in that sense, I'm talking as an administrator.
So I know you're talking about those highly specialized special ed schools.
Yes.
That's where they only do special ed. But there are cases, and we're sitting at one here, where there is a dedicated program, the Access program here, where there really is no general ed component to it. It is 100%. And Randy might disagree with me, but.
Well, I think what I want to do here,
As with Mr. Cashin.
I want to separate.
Yep.
This piece is actually speaking just to approved independent special education schools. The issue that you raise about independent schools that are approved for all students
Yep.
is still the work of rulemaking, still needs to be figured out, and still needs to be addressed. This particular slide is not talking about that.
Are they all extraordinary?
Well, they have been historically, yes. The costs associated with this program have traditionally been considered extraordinary. The current clarification that's been issued that is related to the current definition of special education is changing that so that they're not, if you lower the amount of that tuition that can be considered allowable, you are then, you may not hit the extraordinary cost threshold anymore, and therefore the reimbursement that comes with that.
Is that a certainty?
Oh, yes, in the modeling that individual districts have been doing, yes.
Yeah, and that to me is like there's a category, that's a sort
Correct.
of separate
Yes.
issue, but the Disability Law Project's draft
Right.
rules address the concern by just saying, if an IEP team makes a placement decision in one of these schools, 100% of those costs are allowable expenditures.
Which is what we've done heretofore. As long as I've been administrator, that's how it's
It
worked.
makes it very clear.
In your modeling, how much of that change is attributable to the change, because there is a change going to affect next fiscal year on the threshold for extraordinary costs?
Zero. There's no connection to the threshold.
No, except that because
there is.
because if less of the tuition is considered allowable, it makes it even harder to hit the threshold because the threshold is higher.
Yeah.
Yes.
I thought the threshold was going up.
It is going up.
And the percentage is coming down. So my question was,
Right.
how much, in your modeling, how much of that change is attributable to this definition versus the increase in the threshold?
Speaking as an
Yeah,
individual
just your-
director, they are, it's both, so it's attributable to both. I'm less concerned about the threshold changing than I am about the cost, because the threshold changing is this much of an impact for us, the the removal of how much of it is eligible is
Because the
this
general
much.
ed's adding 20 grand.
Well,
or whatever
yeah, I mean, the agency's new interpretation of existing rule, which both is a different rule and applies this definition issue, essentially renders extraordinary cost meaningless. It doesn't exist anymore.
In a lot of cases,
In a lot of
yeah.
in a lot of the, well, the rates we've seen so far, it suggests that that is gonna be the case.
Dan, under what circumstances wouldn't that be the case?
No, I would just, this is beyond, it is connected, I would agree with Nicole, but it's not our characterization. This is not the purview of the advisory group either, though we are the same people wearing multiple hats dealing with these issues. But we're in the process of working through, we refer to this as the June memo issue. We're in the process of revisiting that issue. We're not done with that. But to conflate the issue, to your question, Peter, firstly, there's no such thing as approved independent special education schools. You know, technically under our regulation, there are approved independent schools. All schools that are dedicated to say that all they do is provide special education first must be approved independent schools, you know. So there's no such thing as that category in our regulation. They exist as approved independent schools under our regulation.
Exactly, that are endorsed in such and such categories.
That's correct. But as you know, they have a general education approval first. Yeah, so there's no separate category of approved special education schools. And the issue of reimbursement or extraordinary reimbursement isn't attached to the school, it's attached to the individual student's program. So it's the individual student's program costs that, if they go over a threshold, trigger extraordinary
And
reimbursement.
that doesn't change in this.
It
funding.
changes under 173, that as Oliver was referring to, that threshold changes as part of a
Right, right.
planned cost shift, if you will. But we have some work still to do on this interpretation of our current regulations. You know, so to Jay's point, this is how we've always done it. You know, this long-standing language that has been very restrictive, in many cases, we're struggling with implementing our current regulations while devising new regulations at the same time and trying to pave a path. And that's the challenge we have right now, sort of paving the path to what will be increased flexibility while also bringing into compliance and regulatory guidance with our current regulations, which are more restrictive than those anticipated under 173. It's a challenge.
I guess the follow-up, I think, Dan, is what triggered the reinterpretation at that point? And when, my understanding, not as a special ed expert in any way, but when students are outplaced, when the intention is they have the most inclusive, free, and appropriate education in the environment, if they need to be outplaced, it's because all facets of their education need to be delivered in a special ed environment. And so what triggered the reinterpretation, and under what circumstances wouldn't you imagine that to be necessary for that outplacement under the law?
Yeah, I think, you know, I could do a longer conversation on it, but I think quickly what triggered our interest was there had been a moratorium. It had to do with rate setting, tuition rate setting for these programs. And there had been a moratorium on rate increases. If you might remember, there was basically a cap on education spending the year before. And that was then applied, you know, if the public education system was being capped at a certain increase, then we were going to freeze special ed tuition rates for these schools, their tuition rates, what they can charge. So in this last fiscal year, independent schools would live under the